Rusk disagrees with you, and he was the Secretary of State at the time, but that's fine.
The communist nations have exploited the turmoil of a time of transition in an effort to extend communist control into other areas of the world.
Thoughts on Gene Rusk and America's involvement in Vietnam? I know next to nothing about that.
Exactly.
Bosnia was the historic boundary between East and West, Islam and Christianity. Most of all, it represented the limits of European integration, of humanitarian concern, and of political interests. One James Gow triumph of the lack of will, international diplomacy in the Yugoslav war. Many Western observers were impressed with the skill of Josip Broz Tito in preserving Yugoslavia's independence from Joseph Stalin's boundless appetites from the end of World War I to his death in 1980. Only after Tito died and wars of secession broke out did it occur to Americans that his greatest achievement had been holding together the diverse peoples of Yugoslavia. It was ironic that the communist autocrat who ruled this one-party state understood the importance of ethnic identity and decentralization to the preservation of Yugoslavia. Tito was half Croat, half Slovene, respected ethnic diversity, but rigorously suppressed separatism. He was especially sensitive to manifestations of Serb nationalism. After his death, Serb nationalism asserted itself in the person of Slobodan Milosevic. The story of U.S. involvement in Bosnia is an interesting counterpoint to the experience in Iraq/Kuwait, Somalia, and Haiti. Here the problem was not overreaching but hesitation in the face of tyranny and mass murder on European turf. It shows the danger of allowing political sensitivities, both domestic and international, to stand in the way of strong action. The first President Bush was reluctant to act because he was in an election. Clinton wanted to act, but the Europeans would not agree. The UN peacekeepers were subject to too many limitations, and the UN Secretary-General insisted on having the final say. The failure to organize a timely and effective response to Slobodan Milosevic demonstrated a global lack of seriousness about a new world order. The Clinton administration was forced to retreat in the face of the lack of support, and Anna Tito's step in to make the difference where the UN had been merely obstructive, setting the scene. Under Tito's governance, Yugoslavia adopted new constitutions in 1946, 1963, 1968, and 1974. The 1974 constitution provided for an 8-member collective presidency, with one representative from each of the 6 republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, and the 2 autonomous provinces Kosovo and Vojvodina. Each region had its own parliament, as well as representatives in the federal parliament. The presidency of the collective executive rotated annually among the 8 states, with the commander-in-chief of the armed forces presiding and the Communist Party reinforcing unity. In 1989, as communist governments throughout Central and Eastern Europe began to break apart, opportunities for free expression and self-determination encouraged the development of separatist movements. Democratic reforms in the neighboring countries of Eastern Europe encouraged reformers in all the Yugoslav states. They also hardened the determination of nationalists everywhere, including Milosevic, who encouraged the Serbian Communist government to resist reform and preserve its power. Ambition, political skill, and control of the Communist Party organization quickly made Milosevic a powerful source of trouble in Serbia and in the Yugoslav federal government. He purged the Communist Party of Kosovo in 1988 and promised to make Serbia whole again by depriving Kosovo and Vojvodina of autonomy and votes, increasing Serb and his own power in the collective bodies. With Serbia effectively exercising the votes of Vojvodina and Kosovo, it would control 3 of the 8 votes in the federal presidency. It could generally count on Montenegro as well, giving a control of 4 of the 8 votes. In January 1990, the Yugoslav Communist Party voted to give up the monopoly and power it had held for 45 years and permit the formation of other parties. In the fall of 1990, the first free elections since 1945 were held in Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Serbia. Nationalist political parties triumphed in the first 2 states. In Serbia, Milosevic won 60% of the votes. In December, he won the presidency again after winning in 1989, and Serbia's communists won 194 of the 250 seats in parliament. Milosevic's re-election had been credited, in part, to a successful rallying of Serbian nationalists who rewarded Milosevic for unilaterally abolishing the provincial legislature in Kosovo and extending Serbia's control, first limiting, then revoking the 1974 statutes that had made Kosovo and Vojvodina autonomous provinces with powers nearly equal to those of the 6 Yugoslav republics. He confiscated the weapons of Kosovo's territorial defense forces and moved to disarm the defense forces of Yugoslavia's other states. Then, in short order, Milosevic began his policy of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, expelling ethnic Albanians, that is, Muslims, from their jobs, homes, and farms, and forcing their relocation. The Muslims' jobs and property were quickly taken over by Serbs from other provinces. From the start, teachers were special targets of the policy, as were trade union leaders, who were also targeted for expulsion, beatings, arbitrary arrests, imprisonment, and shooting. Virtually all institutions in Kosovo were sucked into the purges, which became progressively more brutal too. Slovenian, Croatian, and Bosnian officials watched the evolution of events in Kosovo and in the federal presidency. Milosevic's determined effort to gather all power into his own hands increased the interest of these republics in secession from the federal state of Yugoslavia, an interest that was heightened when Milosevic blocked the scheduled accession of the Croatian representative Stipe Mesic to the rotating presidency. Janez Drnovšek, a member of the collective presidency who later became prime minister of Slovenia, provided a day-by-day account of the deepening political split between those who desired economic and political reforms with multi-party elections and free markets and those who saw reform as a threat to the communist system. 3. In his memoir, Drnovšek asks whether it might have been possible to prevent the breakup of the Yugoslav nation. His answer, yes, the tragic, violent development could have been prevented by prompt and helpful action from outside Yugoslavia. 4. But the needed political and economic aid, swift incorporation into the processes of European integration, and rapid results. 5. To overtake the mounting hostility and disorder were not forthcoming. Western Europe was busy with its own integration. As Slovenia and Croatia leaned toward independence, Milosevic and other Serb leaders insisted that independence was not an option because Serbs were spread throughout Yugoslavia. Members of the collective presidency tried to draw up a balance sheet of each state's debts and credits with the national government. Again and again, Milosevic drove differences to a climax and refused to recognize the authority of the federal executive body. Citizens rallied in the street, calling for his resignation. Beginning in May 1990, Milosevic used the Yugoslav National Army JNA, which he controlled, to try to disarm the militias of each of the republics, demanding that all arms be handed over to the JNA, which was largely controlled by Serbia. Slovenia's militia refused to hand over its weapons, which enabled the republic to declare independence in 1991 and face the national army. Together with Croatia, Slovenia proposed that Yugoslavia become a loose confederation with a democratic multi-party system. In December 1990, 88% of Slovenes voted to separate from Yugoslavia. The Croatian referendum on independence passed with 94% of the vote. Milosevic announced again that if component states of Yugoslavia became independent, Serbia would insist on bringing the 8.5 million Serbs scattered in several areas into a single state and would demand territory commensurate with their numbers. In June 1991, Croatia and Slovenia declared their independence. Immediately, fighting broke out between Croatia and the largely Serb JNA. Brutal from the start, the war included all the elements of ethnic cleansing, siege, murder, confiscation, and destruction of property, rape, beatings, and forced relocation of whole populations. The European Community EC called repeatedly for an end to the fighting and announced that it would recognize no unilateral declaration of independence. The Bush administration was willing to defer to the EC on political matters in Central and Eastern Europe, and the EC and its Luxembourg president Jacques Poos were ready to take charge. The EC appointed a troika to deal with the problem. Poos and the foreign ministers of the Netherlands and Italy, Hans van den Broek and Janilo Michelis, they thought they had achieved their goal of preserving Yugoslavia with the Brioni Agreement, a ceasefire pact signed on July 7, 1991. The agreement stipulated that the Slovenes and Croatians would take no action toward independence for 90 days, the JNA would return to its barracks, and Stipe Mesic would assume the presidency of the federal executive. The agreement came unstuck as soon as it was adopted, but Poos insisted, if anyone can do anything here, it is the EC. It is not the US or the USSR or anyone else. The Americans had no desire to assume responsibility. James Baker, then Secretary of State, commented in his memoir, the Bush administration felt comfortable with the EC taking responsibility for handling the crisis in the Balkans. The conflict seemed to be one the EC could manage. Yugoslavia was in the heart of Europe, and European interests were directly threatened. Our vital national interests were not at stake. 7. The EC asked the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Peter Carrington, to undertake the task of making peace. Carrington convened the first meeting of the Hague Peace Conference on September 7, 1991. He had concluded that Milosevic and Franjo Tudjman, Croatia's prime minister, were prepared to split Bosnia between them, which would surely lead to war. The only way to avoid war, Carrington believed, was to devise a settlement that was acceptable to all. For a brief period, it looked as if he had secured an agreement on a loose association of independent republics, arrangements for protecting minority communities in all republics, including human rights guarantees, and no unilateral changes in borders. The agreement was quickly approved on September 25, 1991 by the UN Security Council. Lord Carrington wrote of this plan, it seemed to me the right way to do it was to allow those who wanted to be independent, to associate themselves with a central organization as far as they wanted to. Those who didn't want to be independent, well, they Yugoslavia. In other words, you could do it a la carte. Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia quickly agreed, but Serbia refused. Milosevic insisted that it was essential for all Serbs to live in one state, not in a number of independent republics. The Carrington Plan called for equal rights for all minorities in all states, but this provision was vetoed by Milosevic, who was interested not in unity or fairness but in a greater Serbia. To that end, he pressed Serbia's claim to sovereignty over Kosovo, whose population was 90% ethnic Albanian Muslim. The violence worsened, even as Carrington continued to seek an agreement in which all minorities had equal rights in all states. Once again, all states except Serbia agreed. Milosevic was unyielding, and this newest attempt also fell apart. Meanwhile, the Bush administration quietly suspended all economic assistance to Yugoslavia, including assistance from international financial institutions, effective May 6, 1991.9. The new UN Secretary-General, Boutros Ghali, proved unhelpful in the process. Boutros Ghali complained that Carrington should have sought his approval of the EC plan before it was submitted to the Security Council. He could have told them that the UN lacked the resources to implement the ceasefire agreement. The Secretary-General stated bluntly that activities relating to peace and security should be managed by him and his staff. This was by no means the last time Boutros Ghali would claim powers for himself, that the UN Charter clearly vests in the Security Council, not in the Secretary-General. The United States and most EC member states favored preserving Yugoslav national unity over self-determination for the republics. Only Austria and Germany, which had the closest historical association with the Croats and Slovenes, expressed sympathy for the aspirations of those who wished to secede. In June 1991, as Slovenia and Croatia moved toward independence, James Baker made a hurried visit to Belgrade where he called for Yugoslav unity, discouraged secession, and rebuked Serb leaders for the repression of Kosovo. He emphasized that diplomatic recognition by the United States would not be forthcoming if any of the republics unilaterally declared independence. At the same time, Germany warned the Belgrade government not to send troops to fight Slovenia and Croatia and said that Bonn would recognize them as independent states. But the Serb attack spread. That same year, Bosnia-Herzegovina also declared its independence. Two top officials of the Bush administration had long personal experience in Yugoslavia. Lawrence Eagleburger, who served as Deputy Secretary of State and then as Secretary of State, had been U.S. Ambassador to Belgrade in the late 1970s and knew Milosevic well. Brent Scowcroft, Bush's national security advisor, had served as an attaché in Belgrade and had written his doctoral dissertation on Yugoslavia. Both men had headed Kissinger Associates after their assignments in Belgrade and had done business with Yugoslav enterprises and leaders during their tenures there. Both were very concerned about the effects of the collapse of central authority. Before Baker traveled to Belgrade, he was briefed by Eagleburger and Scowcroft. Eagleburger emphasized Yugoslavia's history of violent conflict. We believe the only solution to these internal differences in Yugoslavia is an open multi-party democracy throughout the entire country which protects individual rights. The new U.S. Ambassador to Yugoslavia, Warren Zimmerman, a talented Foreign Service officer who had already served 2 tours of duty in Belgrade, also strongly opposed Slovenian independence and the breakup of Yugoslavia. 10 American and European diplomats sought to prevent the disintegration of Yugoslavia, to prevent Croatia and Slovenia from seceding, to prevent the outbreak of violence and war. And after war had broken out, to prevent it from spreading and prevent the establishment of independent states. They failed to achieve any of these goals. Baker and President Bush made trips to the region, where they made strong statements discouraging secession. Baker urged Yugoslav leaders to accept two basic realities: one, that they needed to negotiate their differences, not act unilaterally, and two, that under no circumstances would the international community tolerate the use of force. One, his message to Miloš: if you persist in promoting the breakup of Yugoslavia, Serbia will stand alone. The United States and the rest of the international community will reject Serbian claims to territory beyond its borders. 12. Bush's top advisors were united in the belief that the United States should avoid becoming bogged down in a protracted civil war. They feared that a Yugoslav breakup might encourage present and former republics of the Soviet Union to consider secession. This concern inspired Bush's famous Chicken Kiev speech, in which he declared that Americans will not support those who seek independence in order to replace a far-off tyranny with a local despotism. They will not aid those who promote a suicidal nationalism based upon ethnic hatred. 13. General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued that the United States had no clear military goals in Bosnia and stressed that the solution must ultimately be a political one. 14. Bush, Baker, and Powell expressed no sympathy for the aspirations of the Croatians, Slovenes, or Bosnians, or their desire for independence. Nor did they speak of self-determination. Scowcroft, Bush's national security advisor and good friend, wrote, "Eagle Berger and I were the most concerned about Yugoslavia. We tried very hard to prevent the recognition of Slovenia and Croatia. The British and French agreed, but the Germans for the first time really asserted themselves in the community. The French were very sympathetic to us, but in the end the cohesiveness of the 15 community was more important. 1. Both American and the EC governments were shocked when the Serb-controlled central government used savage force to crush rebellions against the authority it claimed. The U.S. State Department was only slightly behind the British, the French, and the rest of the EC in realizing that this had become the principal problem. On June 25, 1991, Slovenia declared independence. Croatia followed suit. The next day, National Army tanks rumbled into Slovenian towns, but the Slovenes were ready. 44 JNA soldiers were killed and 187 wounded. Slovenia's secession was recognized. Yet the alliance between Slovenia and Croatia soon collapsed, and the JNA began shelling Croatia, including the historic, defenseless cities of Vukovar and Dubrovnik. 3 months of heavy shelling and siege reduced Vukovar to shambles, its inhabitants to hunger and to hiding in basements. The Croats surrendered on November 20, 1991. Many were killed, others were stuffed into overcrowded prisons. Tapes of telephone calls between Milošević and Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic in July 1991 provide clear evidence that Belgrade was making regular secret deliveries of arms to Bosnian Serbs. 16. The tapes also make it clear that Milošević, who was collecting weapons from the republics of Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, was simultaneously directing the JNA to deliver weapons to the Bosnian Serbs in an attempt to build a Bosnian Serb military force and link Serbs in Bosnia and Croatia with those in Serbia. Vojislav Šešelj, a political ally of Milošević, told Der Spiegel that Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and much of Croatia should be transferred to Serbia. 17. On September 21, 1991, a number of European and American publications reported the invasion of Croatia by the JNA. Serbs in Croatia and Bosnia had designated 4 Serb autonomous regions, which then requested protection from the JNA, by then wholly under Serb control. On September 25, at the request of Yugoslavia, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 713, which imposed an arms embargo that froze in place Serbia's huge advantage in weapons and left the newly independent states nearly defenseless at a time when massacres of their populations were already underway. 18. At the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe CSCE, President Bush said that the world must stop Serbian terrorism no matter what it takes, but he later added that the United States would not act without European engagement. The result was that 2 U.S. warships waited off the Adriatic coast for a European naval force that was incredibly slow in arriving to begin monitoring the embargo. The arms embargo, enforced by the United States among others, remained in effect until 1995, when Resolution 1021 recalled previous Resolutions 19, in spite of the fact that the people of Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia had voted in favor of independence, and the countries had been admitted to the UN on May 22, 1992. As UN member states, these nations were entitled to all the rights, privileges, and protections in the UN Charter, including the inherent right to self-defense. The legal interpretation underlying the decision rested on a recommendation of former President Carter's Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, the UN Secretary-General's appointed mediator and personal envoy to Yugoslavia. 1. But Vance, the Secretary-General, and the Security Council had not considered the full implications of imposing an arms embargo in the context of Serb aggression against the people of Croatia and Bosnia, who lacked the means of self-defense. And the resolution did not take into account the clear contradiction between denying Bosnia and Croatia arms to defend themselves and various other Security Council resolutions that dealt with violations of Bosnia's territorial integrity. Because the embargo rendered Croatia and Bosnia virtually defenseless, it became the center of a heated and long-lasting debate in the U.S. Congress between those who wanted to provide arms to the Croatians and Muslims so they could defend themselves, and those who believed that such measures would only further inflame the fighting. An intense debate developed in the UN between the United States, which repeatedly threatened to revoke the embargo unilaterally, and its allies, especially the British and French, who had historic ties with the Serbs and eventually had troops in the UN Protection Force for Croatia UNPROFOR, who they feared would be endangered if arms were provided to the Bosnians. Denying arms to the Croatians and Bosnians laid the foundation for mass slaughter. Newsday correspondent Roy Gutman provided the first descriptions in English of Serb concentration camps. Later, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book A Witness to Genocide, he noted that the Bosnian Serb army, the old Yugoslav army, began to oversee the burgeoning horror of ethnic cleansing, which featured arbitrary executions and wholesale deportations. 21. In November 1991, Serb troops surrounding Dubrovnik broke a multiple ceasefire negotiated weeks before and began shelling the beautiful medieval city. On December 6, Dubrovnik was shelled for 10 hours. The attack would leave its inhabitants without electricity or water for a month. All of its citizens, including Serbs, were engaged in the defense of the city. 222. Accounts of brutality filtered out of Croatia. Gutman told the world what he had learned of the ghastly conditions in the Amarska prison camp. He interviewed survivors who described the unbelievable tragedy. One man said, "I will tell you about the conditions in the camps. All the grass has been eaten by the people. Every day in Amarska, between 12 and 16 people die. In the first 6 days, they don't receive any food. There is no possibility of any visit, no possibility of packages, no medical help. 2/3 of them are living under open skies, in an area like an open pit. When it rains, many of them are up to their knees in mud." 23. Gutman found eyewitnesses and former detainees who described death camps where emaciated men with their heads shaved in an open field were routinely slaughtered. The first British television photos of Amarska appeared, deeply shocking Europe. By this time, reports of savage fighting in the former Yugoslavia were appearing in the Western media. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and other major newspapers published accounts of the destruction of Vukovar and of tens of thousands of Croats and Bosnians driven from their homes and stripped of their possessions. In Europe, reports in Le Monde and the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung estimated that 500,000 persons had become refugees in Croatia alone in the weeks after the fighting broke out, and that the Serbs were using rape as a weapon. As Ambassador Warren Zimmerman later wrote, the pattern of Serb atrocities that continued throughout the war was set in these first few days. Typically, the Serbian paramilitaries would storm a town, killing civilians, and the assault would expel the Muslim population and would turn the town over to Serbs, who, protected by the JNA, could destroy mosques and other Muslim symbols at leisure. Military-aged Muslims were sent to concentration camps, and murder were ubiquitous. 20. 26. Executed. 25. Beatings, rapes, the pressure to act against these atrocities mounted, and blame began to rub off on the Western powers. Some observers believed that Milosevic could not have launched the attacks without the acquiescence of the United States and Western Europe, or at least that their passivity could easily be interpreted as acquiescence. On December 17, 1991, in its first significant unilateral move in foreign affairs since the end of World War II, Germany announced that it would recognize Slovenia and Croatia on January 1, 1992. It was a bold move that reflected Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher's determination to do something for Croatia and Slovenia. But it was a sharp disappointment to Lord Carrington and the U.S. diplomats, who believed that the chances of containing the violence would be far better if no government granted diplomatic recognition to any republics that unilaterally declared independence. Repelled by the Serb offensive, the EC and the Vatican soon followed Germany in recognizing Croatia and Slovenia. On February 21, the Security Council passed Resolution 743 establishing a small peacekeeping force for Croatia on proffer pending a solution of the Yugoslav crisis. The resolution authorized a force of 45,000 troops, but reached a maximum strength of only 39,922. The force was to serve as a buffer separating the Krajina Serbs and the Croatians, monitoring ceasefires and facilitating the return of refugees. In Bosnia, the force was also to escort humanitarian convoys and deter attacks on safe areas. Its cost over 4 years was approximately $46,027,000,000. Unproffer size and mandate were repeatedly enlarged as the situation deteriorated throughout 1992. Although Bosnia-Herzegovina had also become a major target of Serb aggression, Bout-Rosgali rejected the appeals of France, Germany, and Poland to deploy a peacekeeping force there. Violence spread in Bosnia as regular and irregular Serb forces moved with impunity from village to village, pillaging and driving out the inhabitants. On the last day of February 1992, a referendum in Bosnia produced a Bosnian Serb boycott and a strong Muslim-Croat vote in favor of independence. On April 21, the shooting started in Sarajevo, Bosnia's multi-ethnic capital city. Heavy shelling continued throughout April, but no action was taken to defend the unarmed Bosnians. In late May, James Baker announced that the United States had joined in discussions on adopting Chapter Roman 7 sanctions authorizing the use of force. Still, the ever-cautious Baker added, caveat, before we consider force, we ought to exhaust all of the political, diplomatic, and economic remedies that might be at hand. 28. Almost all the parties to this increasingly violent situation were slow to realize that they were truly at war. Nowhere was this clearer than in the extraordinary events surrounding the kidnapping on May 2 of Bosnian President Alija Izetbegovic, who was returning to Sarajevo after a day of fruitless negotiations in Lisbon. No one realized that the JN had taken over the airport. Minutes after Izetbegovic's plane landed, he was a prisoner of the Serbs. In the negotiations that followed, he sought to save himself, his daughter, his party, and his position as president, while JNA sought to secure its control of the airport. Izetbegovic and the Bosnian government by imposing a coup d'etat. UN Commander General Louis Mackenzie described it as the worst day of my life. 29. In extremely complex conversations, President Izetbegovic managed to secure his freedom and that of his daughter, while Bosnia's military commanders ambushed the JNA forces at the airport. By the end of the day, it was clear that the Serbs and Bosnians were engaged in a fight to the death. In the weeks that followed, the situation worsened. Ceasefires were negotiated and violated. Pledges were made and broken. The Sarajevo airport remained closed. The safe routes created for delivery of humanitarian supplies remained tightly shut. Serb mortars pounded Sarajevo's neighborhoods. On May 27, 1992, as the inhabitants of Sarajevo stood in a long line waiting to buy bread, Serbs shelled the bread line, killing 22 people and wounding many others. In the spring and summer of 1992, the UN Security Council passed a series of resolutions calling for the reopening of the Sarajevo airport, which had been closed since early spring. On May 15, 1992, the Security Council passed Resolution 752 demanding that all parties cease efforts to change the ethnic composition of any part of the former Yugoslavia, that Croatians and Serbs who had not lived in Bosnia withdraw from Bosnia, and that all parties cooperate to ensure access to Bosnia's airports and the delivery of humanitarian assistance. The United States joined in Resolution 757, which passed on May 30, 1992, imposing a trade embargo on Yugoslavia, Serbia, and Montenegro and freezing Yugoslav assets abroad and in the United States. Resolutions 758 and 761 banned all military flights over Bosnia-Herzegovina and demanded that the UN and humanitarian organizations be given open access to camps, prisons, and detention centers, but none of these good things happened. Finally, in June 1992, the Security Council passed Resolution 762, belatedly authorizing the deployment of peacekeeping forces to Sarajevo. The Western organizations did not deal well with this conflict. Neither the EC nor the UN nor the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe CSCE roused itself quickly to oppose the violence, which had forced 2.2 million Bosnians to flee their homes by mid-July 1992 and reintroduced into Europe the barbaric notion of ethnic purification that was thought to have died with Adolf Hitler. The international failure to counter this Serbian aggression could be traced to a diverse set of motives. Some governments were inhibited by their historic ties to Serbia. Some argued that the conflict was a hopelessly complicated ethnic struggle in which outsiders should not become involved, or that blame was so evenly divided among the parties that there were no meaningful moral issues. Some governments, notably France, opposed Anatio's involvement, anxious to avoid setting a precedent for a post-Cold War U.S. role in Europe. Everyone equivocated, reminding the world that leaders make a difference. Recently retired heads of state Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan signed public appeals deploring the Serb violence and demanding that Milosevic cease military action against Bosnia and the flow of weapons to Serb forces in Bosnia, turn over heavy weapons to an international body, and permit Bosnian civilians to return to their homes under international protection, or else expect Anatio air power to target and destroy Serb military assets. 30 Secretariat du Prince Sadrid Aga Khan, P.O. Box 6, 1211. Geneva 3, Switzerland. Telephone is 022 346 8866. Telex 129825. Murak. Fax is 022 347 9159. 18 November 1992. World leaders urge Bosnian Action. We are now witnessing in Bosnia a replay of one of the darkest eras of modern history, the invasion of one sovereign nation by another. It is the attempted genocide of people who have lived in peace and tolerance with their neighbors for centuries. The scale of atrocities and the appalling human suffering tell the story. The savagery must be stopped, or the tragedy will spread far beyond Bosnia. People of conscience must speak out now. Every assistance should be provided to help the Bosnian refugees, otherwise countless more will die. The Hun, Gerald Ford. The Hun, Ronald Reagan, Baroness Margaret Thatcher, Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick, General Alexander Haig, J.R. Prince Sadrid Aga Khan. In the summer of 1992, François Mitterrand, the oldest of the Western presidents, flew into Sarajevo in a French helicopter, donned a flak jacket, and spent 7 hours under continuous mortar and sniper fire. The people of Sarajevo are truly prisoners, condemned to murderous blows, and I feel an overpowering sense of solidarity with them, he declared. 31. But his trip had few consequences, perhaps because, in spite of his expression of solidarity, he took no formal action. The shelling eventually became so heavy that General Mackenzie suspended the ongoing airlift of food and medicine, which had barely sustained the city. By this point, Sarajevo had little electricity or water. Many civilians were killed and wounded by mortars and bombs, and the city's hospitals were severely damaged. On August 13, acting under Chapter Roman 7 of the UN Charter, the Security Council passed Resolution 770 authorizing states to use all measures necessary to deliver food and medicine and fuel to Bosnians trapped in cities under siege, and imposing a ban on military flights over all of Bosnia-Herzegovina except for flights in support of UN missions. 32. A month later, a follow-up Resolution 786 was passed providing for monitoring but not enforcing the no-fly zone. In an oblique threat, Baker said that the United States would not accept the blockage of the airport and humanitarian relief. He warned Karadzic that the United States might use air and naval units in Europe to attack Serbian artillery around Sarajevo. Baker held intensive consultations with the other members of the Security Council on how to get food and medicine to Sarajevo, which by now had been surrounded by Serb forces for months. In the United States, impatience grew. Democrats in the Senate, including Claiborne Pell RI, Paul Simon IL, and Joe Biden DE, demanded U.S. participation in delivering food and medicine. General Mackenzie was scheduled to lead the Balkans in the first week of July 1992, and the Canadian battalion, 850 strong, would be leaving with him. It was rumored that he was being removed at the request of the UN because of the Bosnian government's strong feeling that he favored the Serbs. A few years later, the Secretary General would request the recall of French generals Philippe Morlin and Jean Cot because the Serbs felt they favored the Bosnians. Throughout Mackenzie's last day, urgent appeals for help flooded in from amateur radio operators in the Muslim town of Goraz, which had suffered months of siege and repeated ethnic cleansing. Bosnian President Alija Izetbegovic appealed again to President Bush for American air attacks on Serb artillery positions to break the sieges of Goraz and Sarajevo and to clear the way for new shipments of food and water. Bosnian Foreign Minister Haris Salajic appealed for more decisive action from the Security Council or the United States, but the world stood by the Anatio forces idle while heavily armed Serbs slaughtered civilians in the heart of Europe. Secretary General Boutros Ghali's response was unfathomable. Despite urgent appeals, he refused to provide UN peacekeepers for Bosnia when he deployed UNPROFOR troops in Croatia. This elegant francophone Egyptian Copt, who often called himself an African, was preoccupied with Somalia, not Bosnia, which he described as a war of the rich. It was this stated view that the Bosnian Serbs and the Yugoslav government should not be blamed for the violence in Bosnia. 33 Again and again he found excuses for those who attacked Bosnian Muslims. Eventually, the evidence overwhelmed his prejudice, but not until 2 million Croatians and Bosnians had been relocated under conditions that resembled the Nazi relocation of Jews stuffed for days in stifling boxcars without food or water, crowded into prisons and army barracks where women were raped, men beaten to death, and people disappeared. We have reached the end, Bosnian President Izetbegovic told Bernard Henry Levy early in July 1992. We have no food, no arms, no hope. We are the Warsaw Ghetto. Will the world once more leave the people of the Warsaw Ghetto to perish? 34 On July 14, an amateur radio operator in Sarajevo transmitted a similar message. We are awaiting death together. Please tell the world that we beg them to do something to stop these attacks as quickly as possible. Everywhere, Roy Gutman wrote, Serb ethnic cleansing, the euphemism for murder, rape, and torture, was continuing against Muslims and Roman Catholic Croats. The Serb onslaught had displaced 2 million civilians and left 10,000 dead. It was the most vicious conflict seen in Europe or nearly anywhere else since World War II. But the steam had run out of Bush's presidency. 35 According to Gutman, at the G7 meeting early in July 1992, when violence was already widespread in Yugoslavia, Bush had said, I don't think anybody suggests that if there is a hiccup here or there or a conflict here or there that the United States is going to send troops. 36. Bush's reaction was no different from that of other Western leaders, all of whom were essentially passive in the face of near genocide in Bosnia. Despite reports of cruelty worse than anything seen in Europe since World War II, the Western leaders equivocated, procrastinated, and offered only the most measured and detached responses. Though conditions in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina worsened throughout 1991 and 1992, the Western leaders responded to Serbian aggression mainly by assuring one another that there was little they could do. At the end of 1992, Robert Gates, Bush's CIA director, reviewed the war's human costs. At least 19,000 persons have been killed and perhaps another 100,000 have died as a result of the hardships created by the war. At least 3 million Bosnians have lost their homes, and more than 500,000 have fled to neighboring nations. Most of the victims have been Slavic Muslim, who formed 44% of the republic's population before the war, while Serbs made up about 31%. 37. The harsh, dehumanizing policies imposed by Serbs in conquered Bosnian territory bore a stark resemblance to those imposed by Nazi occupiers a half-century earlier. In September 1992, the Associated Press published an abbreviated version of the declaration issued in the Bosnian town of Selmak. 38 Among the many restrictions, non-Serb citizens were not allowed to move around the town from 4 p.m. to 6 a.m., to swim in the rivers, fish, or hunt, drive motor vehicles, to gather in groups of more than 3, to use telephones except in post offices, or to wear uniforms of any kind. They were expected to do any tasks and work assigned to them. The behavior of Bosnia's neighbors and the international organizations in ignoring Serbian brutality demonstrated the inadequacy of the elaborate arrangements that had been constructed to deal with international crises. It also called to mind a July 1938 conference in Evian, France, assembled to consider how to deal with Adolf Hitler. In that infamous meeting, a New York Times correspondent wrote, "The sieges of Sarajevo, Gorazd, and a dozen other Muslim towns and villages, perhaps because he was preoccupied with the presidential election, perhaps also because he was frustrated with the decisions of France and Germany to create a military force outside NATO and take an independent role in policy. Bush preferred that the United States be the leader in international actions as it was in imposing sanctions. If Bush took no effective action, neither did John Major, François Mitterrand, or the French foreign minister, Roland Dumas. Mitterrand's Sarajevo visit became the center of a public controversy after a French documentary film reported that President Izbegovic had personally briefed Mitterrand on Serb massacres of civilians and on the ghastly atrocities at the concentration camps, where thousands had been deported. Mitterrand never mentioned any of this until he was publicly criticized for his silence. Major and British Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd also steadfastly resisted participating in an international response to Serbian aggression. Britain's reluctance to mount air attacks was based on the fear that they might bring Serb reprisals against the 2,700 troops it had on the ground helping to deliver humanitarian supplies. 52 To at least one informed observer, historian Brendan Sims, who has made an exhaustive study of British biases in favor of Serbs and against Bosnian Muslims, against robust resistance to Serb aggression, and against an air war. Hurd and British Defence Secretary Malcolm Rifkind were the two men who bear the greatest responsibility for Britain's disastrous Bosnian policy. 53. On February 8, 1993, after the Clinton administration had assumed control of Yugoslav policy, Bush's last Secretary of State, Lawrence Eagleburger, issued his own epitaph for the Bush policy in Bosnia. "We failed from beginning to end," he said. "As for the ongoing violence," he said, "I don't know any way to stop it except with massive use of military force." 54. The Van Zoen Plan. As the Guard prepared to change in Washington, there was plenty of blame going around. Even before meeting with Clinton's choice for Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, EC negotiator Lord David Owen said presidential campaign, Clinton had delivered strong activist speeches that Owen believed gave hope to beleaguered Bosnian Muslims, encouraging them to resist any peace plan that gave an advantage to the Serbs, as all of them did. But Bosnia's government needed no encouragement to resist these plans. Foreign Minister Haris Seladzic vowed that the Muslims would not negotiate under continuing genocide, that is, until the Serbs stopped shelling Sarajevo, Gorazd, and other villages. In late 1992, Owen and Cyrus Vance unveiled what became known as the Van Zoen Peace Plan 56, which proposed to divide Bosnia into 10 ethnically distinct autonomous provinces. 3 provinces would be dominated by Croats, who made up 17% of the population, 3 by Muslims, who constituted 44% of the population before the ethnic cleansing drove them from their homes, and 3 by Serbs, who made up 31% of the population. 57 Sarajevo, the capital, would be jointly administered. Under the Van Zoen Plan, the elected government of Bosnia, then headed by President Alija Izbegovic, would resign and be replaced by a 9-person interim commission whose members would be equally drawn from each of the ethnic groups. The Croats quickly accepted the plan, but they were the only ones. The Bosnian Serbs were equivocal. They wanted a corridor connecting Serbian enclaves to Serbia, but on January 20, 1993, the Bosnian Serb Assembly reluctantly accepted the plan in principle. The Bosnian Muslims, the principal victims of Serbian aggression, would be the big losers in the Van Zoen settlement. Early in his tenure as EC negotiator, Owen had told the London Financial Times that what has happened in the former Yugoslavia must be reversed. "We are not going to have Muslims treated like the Jews once were in Europe." 58. But to the Bosnians and most of their supporters and sympathizers, it seemed clear that the Van Zoen Plan did reward ethnic cleansing by legitimizing Serb control of land from which Muslims had been driven. It also rewarded Croats, who were already moving to consolidate military control over lands assigned to them under the plan on the grounds that Muslim extremists and fundamentalists would threaten the national identity of the Croatian community in Bosnia. At the same time, the Croats, who had managed to procure some weapons and training, were fighting successfully to reclaim Serbian enclaves in Croatia. None of these events caused Vance or Owen to doubt that their plan could end the fighting if it were imposed by the Security Council and enforced by the major powers. Owen believed that President Clinton should stop all of this loose talk about using force, make it clear to Izbegovic that he's got no real alternative to these negotiations, then provide American troops as part of NATO Force 59. To his credit, Clinton had no stomach for forcing Bosnia to accept a solution that was fundamentally unacceptable. Madeleine Albright, newly appointed U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, had promised that the United States would try to make a peace settlement which does not punish the victims and does not reward the aggressors. 60. The Van Zoen Plan not only awarded the Serbs most of the areas from which Muslims had been driven, it also gave them political representation far beyond their numbers. The Bosnian government was dismantled, Bosnia's constitution scrapped. Selajic spoke for the Bosnian government when he said, "We, as a member of the United Nations, will never accept the abolition of our constitution and our legality, which are based on free and democratic elections." Nevertheless, the British and French governments signed on to the plan. The EC and Russia offered encouragement. Initially, Warren Christopher leaned toward accepting the plan with some changes, tightening the sanctions against Serbia and Montenegro, creating a war crimes tribunal, and enforcing the ban on Serb flights over Bosnia and Herzegovina. Surprisingly, he did not mention lifting the arms embargo or press for enforcement of existing security Council resolutions. A New York Times headline announced that Clinton supports current Bosnia Peace Plan 61. On February 10, 1993, Christopher announced that the United States would become actively involved in the negotiations and would not deploy troops in Bosnia for any purpose except to enforce an agreement that was accepted by all parties. Colin Powell, still serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, continued to operate on the basis of the Weinerger-Powell Doctrine, which called for using force decisively to attain clear objectives. 62. After studying the Vanson plan further, however, Christopher changed his position, describing it legitimizing the ill-gotten gains from ethnic cleansing. With Senator Bob Dole leading congressional opposition to the plan, Clinton's Secretary of Defense Les Aspin proposed as an alternative approach to lifting the arms embargo to permit Bosnians to defend themselves while using U.S. air power to enforce the no-fly zones and knock out Serb artillery and airfields. The UN turned down Aspin's proposal. Vance and Owen had labored long, but their plan was neither fair nor enforceable. It was finally abandoned not because it was unacceptable to Bosnia, but because the Bosnian Serbs put it to a popular referendum where it was rejected by more than 90% of those who voted. In the wake of its failure, a coalition known as the Contact Group, consisting of France, Germany, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, tried to restart the peace process in the spring of 1994 by attempting to resolve the ongoing territorial issues, but that plan, too, failed after it was rejected by the Bosnian Serbs. In this period, Serbs and Croats often collaborated in attacking Bosnia's Muslims. Milosevic and Croat President Franjo Tudjman had previously discussed dividing Bosnia and Herzegovina between them, but Milosevic was resistant to the agreement. He and Karadzic were apparently moved only by the prospect of enhancing Serb power and did not hesitate to ignore ceasefire agreements they had signed. It was clear to all that Milosevic had no interest in a peace that established democratic self-government for Bosnia or Kosovo or protected the minority rights of Muslims. He had no intention of demilitarizing Kosovo, reducing his forces, or implementing a ceasefire. Instead, he escalated his campaign of violence. In 1993, the cold-blooded murder of Bosnia's Deputy Prime Minister, Hakija Turajic, seriously called into question UN competence and rules of engagement. 63 As the nation's vice president, Ejup Ganik, said the assassination was in the United Nations a PC, on a road controlled by the United Nations and under the protection of UN soldiers. The United Nations is responsible for this tragedy. 64 The true responsibility for the murder, of course, lay first and foremost with the Serb soldier who fired 7 shots into the deputy prime minister, but it was shared by the UN officer in charge and by the UN itself, whose rules of engagement made it unnecessarily difficult to protect Turajic. The armored vehicle carrying Turajic was halted at gunpoint by a force of 40 Serbs. One of the UNPROFOR troops assigned to guard him, probably the French officer in charge, Colonel Petrus Sartor, opened the locked back doors of the vehicle, leaving him exposed to the Serb assailants. A peacekeeper was asked if he had fired at the man who killed Turajic. Returning fire, he explained, is not permitted under UN rules of engagement except to save your own life. 65. In February 1993, the Security Council passed Resolution 808, establishing the International Criminal Tribunal to investigate and prosecute war crimes committed in the former Yugoslavia. But the siege of Sarajevo continued unabated, with no war criminals arrested or charged. In June, airstrikes were again authorized but not conducted, and those 6 Muslim towns were declared safe areas. None were safe. All remained under attack and without food and medicine. Peacekeeping. The United States meets the UN. Rules of engagement. At the start of 1993, 3 enclaves in eastern Bosnia remained under Bosnian government control. Each was desperately overcrowded and undersupplied, overflowing with refugees from other towns that had been attacked, and each was surrounded by Serb forces. Sniping and heavy artillery cut them off from food, medicine, and supplies. Despite UN resolutions and the assurances of Serb officials, UNHCR convoys bearing aid were repeatedly denied passage. Inside the towns, hunger became starvation and people died. In a report to the U.S. Agency for International Development USAID, humanitarian relief expert Thomas Brennan charged that the United States and the UN were clearly failing to prevent genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina and may actually be facilitating its implementation. 66 Brennan also blasted the UN High Commissioner for Refugees UNHCR, who had generally opted for negotiation and appeasement rather than forceful determination to deliver relief supplies to those most in need, and concluded that immediate U.S. political leadership and military intervention is essential to halt genocide in Bosnia. 67 Herzegovina. The UN's typical unwillingness to take forceful action unfortunately characterized its response to ethnic cleansing. It was no surprise that the Serbs opposed relief for Bosnian Muslims, whom they were systematically starving and driving out of the country. But the opposition of UN commanders to the airdrops of food and medicine, as if there were some sort of international duty to stand in a neutral pose while Muslims died, was another matter entirely. In Bosnia, to require neutrality was to suggest moral equivalence between the refugees who were forced to flee their homes and those who forced them to flee. By early 1993, the community of Srpska in eastern Bosnia had been cut off for 7 months. People were reduced to eating leaves, animal fodder, and the bark of trees, and many froze to death. They lived under constant shelling, with no medical supplies. Those who were wounded or ill usually died. Damaged arms and legs were amputated with hacksaws and without anesthesia. Those too old or ill to flee were beaten unmercifully, and amateur radio operators reported massacres of the people remaining at Srpska. From Zepa, another safe area, a shortwave radio operator broadcast a cry for help from a frozen hell. The 29,000 people of Zepa were described as too exhausted to dig graves in the frozen ground. 68 There was no electricity, no running water, no heat. There were no houses, few clothes, no live animals. All had been killed by Serb shelling. The town had been under siege for months. The broadcast continued, "I beg to all humanitarian organizations to help us. My personal statement, and from all the people of Zepa, is that we don't trust the United Nations any longer, but we have great confidence in the American people. It's only the Americans whom we can trust now. 69 The UNHCR had agreed to consider making emergency airdrops of food to Zep and 2 or 3 other beleaguered cities. Incredibly, UN officials told the Bosnian government that this could only be done if the Serbs agreed. They did. 70 Not. Traditional peacekeeping requires the consent of all parties to a conflict, able to peace among the parties, and peacekeepers committed to strict neutrality. Yet none of these circumstances obtained in Bosnia. Serbia denied that it was an active participant in a war against the Bosnian Muslims and did not consent to the deployment of peacekeepers on its border with Bosnia. And the UN peacekeepers could hardly be neutral when the UN had called for acts in support of Bosnia. In a series of resolutions, the Security Council had authorized safe havens and necessary measures to deliver humanitarian assistance, declared a no-fly zone, and put monitors on the Serb border to stop the flow of vehicles, weapons, ammunition, oil and gas, and food from Serbia into Bosnia. These resolutions were not consistent with neutrality or equal treatment of the parties, but they were followed regardless. Balkans believed the peacekeepers should be studiously neutral, never affecting the balance of power between the contending forces. In Bosnia, the Secretariat restricted its peacekeeping force to the sacrosanct UN rules of engagement. Yet like UN peacekeeping itself, those rules had no formal standing. They were simply conventions that had developed over time in small conflicts in places like Cyprus, Kashmir, the Golan Heights, and southern Lebanon. The UN forces following these rules in Bosnia failed to contain violence, prevent the shelling of civilians, deliver food to the hungry, or ensure safety in the safe havens, but no authority challenged the appropriateness of these rules to this specific region or conflict. In Somalia, the Bush administration had declined from the outset to be bound by such rules. The American forces who entered Somalia in Operation Rescue did not have the consent of General Mohammed Farah Aidid. They were not neutral, and they used force. Though some participants in the Somalia peacekeeping operations complained that the use of force increased the dangers in the region, Boutros-Ghali dismissed the complaints. We have to use force to disarm the various forces. Without that, we will not be able to promote national reconciliation and offer humanitarian assistance to the populations. This was equally true in Bosnia. In Somalia, UN policies had been flexible and fairly successful. In Bosnia, they were rigid and timid and achieved little. Certainly, they did not help the Bosnian Muslims. Each effort by the Security Council to modify the terms under which UN forces operated in Bosnia met with resistance from the Secretariat, and personal heroism was not consistent with UN rules of engagement. In March 1993, when the UN commander for Bosnia, General Philippe Morland, demonstrated extraordinary personal courage to expedite the delivery of food and medicine to Srebrenica, the Secretary-General asked the government of France to recall him. By January 1993, UN troops in Bosnia were being widely condemned for failing to protect the people they had been sent to protect. The director of UN relief operations for Bosnia, José Mendelus, reported that convoys bearing food, fuel, and medicine were being blocked or turned back from the area, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. Mendelus asked the UN to ask ANATO to airlift supplies to the estimated 150,000 Bosnians in danger of starving and freezing. 71 assuming, like almost everyone else, that planes dropping food to starving people under siege would be protected. Yet the British resisted introducing any further military elements into Bosnia, including protection for humanitarian aid. During his presidential campaign, Bill Clinton had promised repeatedly that he would airlift food to the Bosnians to save them from starvation. Clinton had barely been inaugurated before the UNHCR made a passionate appeal to him to airdrop food and medicine. José Mendelus, director of UN relief operations for over 1.5 million Bosnians in safe areas such as Zepa, Srpska, and Srebrenica, publicly stated that civilians in these towns were dying of starvation and incessant shelling. 72 In March 1993, without securing Europe's approval, the United States began dropping food into Bosnia. Boutros-Ghali approved the plan only after Clinton agreed that the U.S. planes would fly without military escorts and would make the drops from about 10,000 feet, which greatly reduced their accuracy. Despite these limits, UN professionals and others later agreed that the drops were critical to the survival of the Bosnians. But the Serbs' merciless attacks in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia continued, and the presence of the severely restricted UN peacekeepers was doing little to stem its tide. Ethnic cleansing was in full force in Banja Luka, Bosnia's second-largest city. The Serbs were attacking private homes with grenades, firing non-Serbs from their jobs, looting and seizing Muslim property, and murdering Muslims. Some 20,000 Muslims and 5,000 Croats fled the area in January 1993. 73 UN Commander General Louis Mackenzie of Canada and his successor, General Michael Rose of Great Britain, were repeatedly charged with partiality to the Serbs. Yet the Americans still sent no men and no commanders to the region. Early in 1993, the Clinton administration moved tentatively to a more active role in Bosnia. Soon after he took office, Secretary of State Warren Christopher attempted to persuade the U.S. allies to lift the arms embargo and mount airstrikes against the enemy. This policy was widely supported in the U.S. Congress, but was opposed by the Europeans, and Christopher made little progress. The continued violence presented Clinton with an extremely difficult decision: should he commit U.S. troops to peacekeeping under a UN command that seemed incompetent and ineffective, and that imposed rules of engagement that would render them nearly helpless and unable to achieve most of their goals. The Serb forces, which had driven the Muslims out of one Bosnian town after another, were closing in on Srebrenica. By April 1993, they had begun shelling this last Muslim town in East Bosnia, now jammed with refugees. Once again, unarmed inhabitants of a large Muslim town waited helplessly while Serb forces prepared to drive them from their homes. Now it was Bill Clinton's turn to explain why he was not doing more. I've done everything that I know to do consistent with the possibilities we have for further action. In the United Nations with our European allies and the members of the Security Council, Clinton said, "It is a very frustrating and difficult situation." 74 In many cases, he asserted, the United States was willing to do more than its allies, who resisted virtually every proposed move to counter Serbian ethnic cleansing of Bosnia. But except for the food drops undertaken in the face of European and UN resistance, the United States did not act on its own, and Clinton quickly became the second American president who allowed the Europeans to stifle the impulse to action. There was some truth in the excuses offered for every capitulation, but no adequate explanation of why President Clinton so quickly accepted the limits on U.S. action in Bosnia that candidate Clinton had harshly criticized. "If you believe that we should engage these problems in a multilateral way," he said, "if you believe in what happened in a good way in Operation Desert Storm, then the reverse is to be true, too. The United States has got to work through the United Nations, and all of our views may not always prevail." 75 Apparently, he had forgotten that Desert Storm was conducted under American command. Was it the search for consensus among the permanent members of the Security Council that led Clinton to abdicate American leadership in the Balkans? Did he see unilateral action as incompatible with U.S. commitments to NATO? Christopher had promised that the new administration would bring the full weight of American diplomacy to a search for a negotiated settlement after which U.S. troops would help enforce the peace. But it often seemed that he did not fully understand the many obstacles to peace. He assured all that the new administration would take immediate steps to reduce suffering and bloodshed, including enforcement of the no-fly zone under the UN resolution. He called on all parties to expedite the flow of humanitarian aid to relieve suffering. He suggested that American forces might be used to ensure safe passage of food and medicine to areas under siege, and reiterated that the Clinton administration planned to work with Vance and Owen to make their proposals more acceptable to the Muslims. 76. In March 1993, Special Rapporteur Mazwicki made an urgent appeal to the UN Human Rights Commission, then meeting in Geneva. Serb officials agreed to give UNHCR brief access to prison camps and towns under siege. On March 5, General Moreland, the French UN commander for Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the UNHCR representatives arrived in Srebrenica for a fact-finding mission. The facts were not difficult to ascertain. Serb forces temporarily diminished their shelling, but resumed it as soon as Moreland left. Many people who tried to escape behind his convoy were ambushed and murdered. Among those who stayed, many died under the intensified shelling. On March 12, General Moreland arrived again in Srebrenica, where he announced that he would remain until Serb officials permitted evacuation of the wounded. 9 days later, a single UN aid convoy was admitted to Srebrenica. Conditions continued to deteriorate. On April 2, Sadako Agata, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, wrote to the Secretary General, "His people are desperate to escape to safety because they see no other prospect than death if they remain where they are." Agata saw only two options: one, immediately enhance the international presence, including UNPROFOR, turn the area into a United Nations protected area UNPA and provide life-saving assistance, or two, organize a large-scale evacuation of the endangered population. Safe areas established. Although the Special Rapporteur had explicitly recommended the establishment of security zones in Bosnia and Herzegovina in November 1992, nearly 6 months passed before the Security Council passed Resolution 819 on April 16, 1993, established Srebrenica as a safe area, an area theoretically free from armed attack or any other hostile act. The resolution also demanded that the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Serbia, and Montenegro immediately stop supplying weapons to Bosnian Serb paramilitary units. 77 in May, in Resolution 824, the Security Council declared that Sarajevo, Tuzla, Zapogorje, Bihać, and Srebrenica should be treated as safe areas from which all Bosnian Serb military and paramilitary forces should withdraw. UNPROFOR task was not to defend a geographical area, but to protect the civilian population of the area against armed attack. As Mazwicki noted, however, the safe areas were safe only on paper. The Security Council refrained from authorizing the additional troops deemed necessary by the Secretary General to ensure full implementation of UNPROFOR's mandate. 78. The safe areas were mobbed by displaced persons, overwhelmingly women and children. People were dying daily from shelling, starvation, illness, and wounds. By summer's end, the Serb shelling, sniping, and starving of civilians had resumed. In August, Resolution 836 reaffirmed the safe areas, extended the mandate of UNPROFOR, enlarged them, and authorized the use of air power to support the mandate. But by then the Bosnian Serb leadership thought it had prevailed. Its detestable purification of Bosnia was nearly complete. Entire Bosnian Muslim communities had been destroyed in the merciless military campaign to establish exclusive Serbian power over the country. One by one, Muslim towns had been attacked by Serb mercenaries and regular army troops, their pawns driven out, swelling the refugee population to 1.6 million. It was the largest wave of refugees in Europe since World War II. Sarajevo's airport had been shut down for months, and the city was surrounded by Serb troops. Food was so scarce that many families lived on one meal a day. Diabetics lacked insulin, the wounded lacked antibiotics and painkillers. The international community managed little effective action. Neither the sanctions imposed on Serbia by the UN Security Council nor the arms embargoes were working. UNPROFOR was not an effective force. Ceasefires were negotiated and violated, pledges made and broken. Safe routes created for the delivery of humanitarian supplies were shut tight. Serbian mortars pounded Sarajevo's neighborhoods almost daily and fired on safe areas packed with refugees. In the last 3 months of 1993, there were 225 violations of the no-fly ban, Western non-response. The commitment, dedication, and heroic style of UN Commander General Philippe Moreland and his fact-finding missions illustrated what the international community could have been doing to stop the devastation. His behavior threw the feckless performance of the UN and the EC, and the United States into embarrassing contrast, paving the way for high-ranking UN officials to call for the removal of Moreland, whom the French media were calling General Courage in April 1993. The Serb government complained bitterly that General Moreland was not neutral and objective in drawing distinctions between the refugees and their oppressors. In the UN Secretariat, anonymous officials alluded to Moreland's habits of exceeding instructions, violating the rule of neutrality, and attracting too much media attention. They discreetly requested his recall. No one in the Secretariat or the French government acknowledged their intentions to remove General Moreland, although France's Defense Minister François Léotard said that Moreland would probably be back in Paris by May. The treatment of General Moreland was an exercise in cynicism, like sending NATO planes to patrol the no-fly zone and then not permitting them to enforce it. Though Boutros Ghali insisted on his policy of neutrality, the events in Bosnia dramatized the need to rethink the theory and practice of UN peacekeeping, indeed of UN military involvement in international conflicts and in the provision of humanitarian assistance. It was not clear, for example, that peacekeeping forces should ever have been committed to Croatia, where their presence protected Serbian conquests, or to Bosnia, where a major war of aggression had been underway for a year and the presence of UN peacekeeping forces was repeatedly used as an excuse for inaction. The arms embargo was the clearest example of a UN action that made the situation worse. By the time Clinton was inaugurated in January 1993, the homes, families, communities, and lives of Bosnia's Muslim population had been largely destroyed. Yet no wave of outrage swept the world at this genocide in the heart of Europe. The Serb offensive had destroyed the existing Bosnian society in less time than it took the international community to pass resolutions promising to use necessary force to deliver food and medicine. It was difficult not to conclude that the indecision and inaction of Western governments, which chose not to act effectively either unilaterally or through the UN, NATO, the WEU, the EC, or the contact group, constituted passive acquiescence in Serb aggression. It was not the first time in the 20th century that the West had been faced with organized brutality, and not the first time Western leaders had equivocated and procrastinated and offered only the most measured and detached response. Their busy non-response to Serb aggression recalled the inaction of the Western leaders who confronted Adolf Hitler at the outset of World War II. But this time the West had several activist leaders: Margaret Thatcher, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, EC President Jacques Delors, and a bit later Bill Clinton used the media to draw attention to the problems and raise the stakes. These leaders spoke boldly about alternatives that John Major, Francois Mitterrand, and George H.W. Bush had preferred not to consider. Thatcher, the former prime minister, insisted that Bosnia was a defining moment, and she was right. The world's response to Serbian genocide defined its lack of seriousness about a new world order and collective security from aggression. It illustrated the ineptitude of the elaborate international institutions constructed to deal with just such crises. In this first test of the post-Cold War period, the WEU was partially incapacitated by the EC's dangerous lack of resolve against which Delors had warned. NATO was partially incapacitated by French opposition to its participation. The UN was partially incapacitated by the reluctance and indifference of its member states, and by Bout Rozgali's resistance to involvement in what he called a rich people's war. 79. The Red Cross was partially incapacitated by the Serbs' denial of access to prison camps and by its own lack of a sense of urgency. The United States was partially incapacitated by a lack of empathy among some of the people in the administration and in Congress who were responsible for foreign policy. The UN response also was distorted by its pose of neutrality. For years, some UN officials and Security Council members clung to its contention that this war of aggression was a civil war. The Serb systematic destruction of Bosnia was an ugly model for fanatical nationalists and would-be aggressors and dictators in other parts of Central and Eastern Europe. It trivialized efforts to establish collective security, and it sapped the intellectual and moral foundations of collective action anywhere. Thatcher advised European and American leaders to issue a series of ultimatums to the government of Slobodan Milosevic: cease military action and the flow of weapons into Bosnia, or else tell Serb forces in Bosnia to turn over their heavy weapons to an international body, or else permit Muslims to return to their devastated homes under international protection, or else. She advised the United States and the EC to tell Milosevic that failure to do these things would result in the destruction of Serb military assets and the encouragement by all means of opposition groups. Serbia, she noted dryly, was not a world power. It was a savage, racist regime for which there was no room in 81 any new world order worth preserving. 80. Yet Bout Rozgali raised objections against these proposals for effective action, as he had more than once before. In July 1992, he had opposed implementation of the London Agreement, which called for Serbia to deliver its heavy artillery to UN forces. In September, he had opposed enforcing the no-fly zone. A few months later, out of fear of offending the Serbs, he had resisted airdropping food to towns filled with starving people. The news that 4 Bosnian residents of a home for the aged had frozen to death in a single night a block from UN headquarters in Sarajevo did not help the UN's reputation for humanitarian concern and efficacy. Cyrus Vance's personal efforts to prevent U.S. officials from meeting with Bosnian President Alexej Begovic in Washington, where he met with President Clinton in the fall of 199,382, did not help Vance's reputation as an even-handed, humane mediator. Many Bosnians, Croatians, Africans, and Cambodians began to see the UN as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The UN Secretariat functioned like many other bureaucracies. It took action only by consensus, which was hard to build and harder to maintain. Responsibility was so widely shared and so depersonalized that ordinary moral and social disciplines disappeared. Where everyone is responsible, no one is responsible. If it is difficult to hold governments responsible for their actions, holding international institutions is even more difficult. At the same time, the EC, the Security Council, and the member states did not challenge Bout Rozgali's unprecedented assertions of authority. Although he was described as an activist Secretary General, he resisted all but the most limited peacekeeping in Bosnia. When the Security Council considered enforcing the no-fly zone or the delivery of humanitarian assistance, Bout Rozgali appealed for more time to find a political solution. The result was continued Serb aggression against a background of endless negotiation. Although the UN Charter vests executive power in the Security Council, its member states accepted the Secretary General's priorities and programs as if he were the chief executive in a presidential system and the Security Council a rubber-stamp legislature. By May 1993, the already disastrous human situation had worsened as Serb forces launched successive attacks on the region's remaining Muslim towns, which had grown more swollen with refugees. Despite the powerful moral argument for using American air power to save Bosnians, all sides ventured further counterarguments on both moral and practical grounds. Britain, France, Belgium, and other countries with troops on the ground feared that airstrikes would endanger their troops. Many Americans feared that airstrikes would constitute an open-ended U.S. commitment that could end in a Balkan quagmire. Others believed that a unilateral U.S. decision in favor of airstrikes would violate international norms and endanger peacekeeping forces. Still others argued that American national interests were not involved in the Balkans, and the U.S. government should not commit military forces. This left President Clinton with a critical decision: whether to commit American power under UN command in the pursuit of purely altruistic goals. In his first year as Secretary of State, Warren Christopher sought allied cooperation in removing the arms embargo. He sought greater use of NATO air power for a lift-and-strike strategy to lift the embargo and strike the aggressors, to remove the Serb sieges and open the way for humanitarian assistance to the people who were trapped without food, heating fuel, or medicine. But nothing came of his efforts, and soon the administration seemed to be backpedaling from its constructive stance. "We can't do it all," Christopher said. "We have to save our power for those situations which threaten our deepest national interests. Bosnia is a humanitarian crisis a long way from home in the middle of another continent. So U.S. actions are proportionate to our responsibilities." 83. In a luncheon briefing with reporters, Peter Tarnoff, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, explained that Christopher had not failed to persuade European allies to join the United States in stronger action in Bosnia. Rather, he had not really tried. He had gone to Europe to consult, not in a serious effort to rally the Europeans around U.S. recommendations to use airstrikes and lift the arms embargo. 84. This was one of several early signals of the Clinton administration's retreat from global leadership, signals that came as a surprise to many. Who could have predicted that Clinton would not approve his own Clinton doctrine for Bosnia? When the story of Tarnoff's briefing on Christopher's trip hit the Washington Post, the administration realized that such a renunciation of U.S. leadership would reduce American influence and might be taken by potential aggressors as an invitation to action. 85. The White House quickly distanced itself from Tarnoff's characterization that is not our foreign policy, a high-level spokesman announced, and Christopher clarified there is no derogation of our powers and our responsibility to lead. But these denials did not dispel the signs of an American reluctance whose consequences were already being felt around the world. The Clinton team's intention to disengage were apparent in a series of developments: deep cuts in the defense budget, the inability of NATO defense ministers to agree on much of anything except to pass the Bosnian issue back to the UN Security Council, the concessions Clinton offered to North Korea in advance of negotiations on its nuclear intentions, the unconditional extension to China of most favored nation MFN status, the unconditional diplomatic recognition of the MPLA, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, government of Angola, and the unconditional release of financial assistance to the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. This same reluctance could be seen in the administration's lack of response to Iraq's provocations and its inaction on the North American Free Trade Agreement (NFTA) and related hemispheric matters. In the face of such challenges, Christopher and other Clinton administration officials tended to shift ground, redefine goals, and, in the case of Bosnia, to claim impotence in the face of Serbia's escalating demands. As New York Times reporter John F. Burns wrote in July 1993, for a while, Serbian political and military chiefs appeared ready to halt the seizure of territory and the raping, killing, and expulsions of Muslims that began when the Serbian military campaign began in April 1992. Instead, United Nations officials say Mr. Clinton's decision to bow to European nations like Britain and France and their reluctance to launch military strikes or lift an arms embargo against the outgunned Bosnian government caused the fighting and the suffering of civilians to worsen rapidly. 86. As candidate and president, Clinton expressed outrage over the Serbs' brutality. National Security Advisor Tony Lake and the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Madeleine Albright, also seemed to feel deeply about Bosnia. But Christopher had sounded a milder note in his testimony before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Strictly speaking, he said, some of the acts that had been committed by various parties in Bosnia, principally by the Serbs, could constitute genocide under the 1948 Convention. He spoke of atrocities on all sides and merely that the Bosnian Serbs were most at fault of the three parties. 87. Christopher's testimony suggested that he and the administration were distancing themselves from what he described as a multilateral problem that must have a multilateral response. The United States must be wise, and being wise means acting in ways that are consistent with our national interests. 88. But that was precisely the challenge to know our national interests. The United States had fought two costly wars in Europe largely because American presidents had believed that our national interests were tied to the European continent. Now Christopher seemed to be suggesting that what was at heart a European problem need be of little concern to the United States. The notion that aggression must not be rewarded lest it invite further aggression had been the core concept of U.S. foreign policy at least since World War II. That was why Harry Truman signed and the Senate ratified the UN Charter with its clear-cut prohibition on the use of force and equally clear-cut provision of self-defense in Article 51. It was the reason Truman sent U.S. troops to South Korea when North Korea attacked. It was why George H.W. Bush provided U.S. leadership for action on Kuwait. In the Bosnian conflict, however, the United States sometimes acted as though a greater national interest lay in preserving consensus with its allies rather than in discouraging aggression, and the search for consensus in the Security Council seemed to take priority over protecting a people from destruction. Even as Christopher spoke, Karadzic was making radical, new demands for more territory, more ethnic cleansing, and a Serbian state whose realization would require expelling tens of thousands more Bosnian Muslims from their homes. Karadzic said, there will be a Serbian republic once and for good, and anybody who wants to deal with us is to take that into account. Serbian General Ratko Mladic echoed the sentiment. We are a unified people living in the land of our grandfathers. That was not true. The Bosnian Serb state was founded on nationalism and violence, consisted of bombed cities and burned villages, and included many largely Muslim towns and tens of thousands of Muslim and Croat refugees. Many Americans, myself among them, believed that President Clinton and some of his predecessors had been right to urge air strikes, right to support the lift strike option, right to refuse to sign the Vance-Owen plan because it rewarded aggression, and right to promise that no U.S. ground troops would be committed to combat in Bosnia under UN command, but wrong to announce that we would not use air power unilaterally. By July 1993, it seemed obvious that the Clinton administration was deferring to the British, the French, and the UN on these critical issues. As John Burns reported in the New York Times, senior UN officials felt powerless to mitigate the suffering. The last hope of halting the killing and slow starvation of Muslims seemed to have disappeared, they said, when Clinton decided not to commit American military forces. 89. Peter Kessler, spokesman for the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, observed that the Serbs and Croats were behaving as though they can do anything that said that the U.S. president had turned his attention back to domestic affairs. But some in the Clinton administration understood that abandoning an effort in which the human stakes were so high was certain to diminish the administration's credibility, its capacity to influence events elsewhere, and, above all, its reputation for leadership. Some understood that taking this path would diminish Bill Clinton's standing in the world. Some members of the administration understood that, more than anything, Bosnians needed arms. In July 1993, approximately 315 American soldiers were deployed with a UN peacekeeping force on the border between Macedonia and Serbia. The UNPROFOR troops were concerned that the Americans might be too heavily armed and might violate the spirit of peacekeeping. Scandinavian commanders moved quickly to teach the American soldiers to surrender on demand, fire only in self-defense, and travel in small, light personnel carriers instead of large, intimidating vehicles. The commanders were determined that the U.S. forces would respect the UN rules of engagement, which called for strict neutrality, minimal weaponry, and non-confrontational behavior. Unfortunately, the Serbs were not operating under the same rules as 3 American peacekeepers learned when they were kidnapped and held for several days. Arms suppliers. One thing the Bosnian Muslims and the Croatians shared was a need for arms to defend themselves against the relentless attacks of the Serbs. In 1992, a group of 3 Croatians, a Pole, and 2 Germans were arrested for smuggling $45 million worth of arms, mainly Kalashnikov rifles and U.S. Stinger missiles, into Croatia. A second shipment included a complete Soviet anti-aerial system that was carried in by way of bogus end-user certificates from Poland. End-user certificates name the selling and recipient countries, but may be used to send the arms to a third country. Soon Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey were sending weapons to the Bosnian Muslims, with end-user certificates saying they were going to Africa. Once at sea, freighters said to be headed for Africa, Asia, or the Middle East changed course and headed to Bosnia. Unfortunately, many of the arms intended for Bosnia were unloaded on Croatia's Dalmatian coast. Croatia had less difficulty than Bosnia in recruiting Western military advisors and buying Western arms. Germany was ready to help, as were Italians and some American freelance military trainers. When they had arms, Croatians and Bosnians fought well, but the arms were slow in arriving. Almost as soon as the UN peacekeeping troops arrived in Croatia in 1992, the first place they were deployed, the Croatian government had complained that the 14,000 UNPROFOR troops were not acting with sufficient force to compel compliance with the negotiated truce. The Croatians promised to liberate every inch of Croatia with their modern army, 91, and quite soon they demonstrated they could and would do just. The Croatians had money, foreign connections, and help in training their forces. They had financial backers abroad, mainly Germans and Croatian immigrants. Croatia's long Dalmatian coastline enabled them to receive diverse weapons, including those intended for landlocked Bosnia. A tacit agreement among some nations, presumably including the United States, as well as Iran and other Muslim states, allowed $1.03 billion of weapons to be smuggled into the country. They were also helped by the presence in Zagreb of a number of employees of a private American military consulting firm who trained Croatian officers. Croatian officers attended a course offered by private companies and headed by former U.S. Army General Harry Soyster. The course, called Military Professional Resources, was conducted by 15 former U.S. Army generals, colonels, and master sergeants. It prepared the Croatians for the offensive in the summer of 1995 that wrested Krajina from the Serbs. This left an impression that the United States supported the building of Croatian strength. 92. Lieutenant General Jean Cot, the French UN commander who served from June 1, 993 to March 1994, spoke harshly of the Pontius Pilate solution, peacekeepers bound by UN rules of engagement that demanded that they remain neutral in the face of starvation and mass murder. 93. These rules, Cot said, rendered peacekeepers impotent, like goats tethered to a stake, unable to keep peace, protect unarmed victims, or prevent the spread. Why then did the French and British so ardently oppose lifting the arms embargo that denied Bosnians the capacity to defend themselves? Why did French Defense Minister François Léotard oppose NATO airstrikes even in the face of Sarajevo's agonies, saying as if there were no urgency? With regard to any eventual action on security zones, it should be preceded by a political consultation, first among Europeans, then with Americans, with the then commander of the UN forces directly involved. Why did the Clinton administration wait so long before mobilizing NATO and urging airstrikes? NATO had already agreed to support the Security Council if it voted to enforce the ban on Serbian flights over Bosnia and Herzegovina, which would have marked the first time NATO forces defended a country outside the alliance. Although he was personally committed to effective action, Clinton appointed two secretaries of defense who were nearly as uncomfortable with the use of force as the UN Secretariat. The first, Les Aspin, declined to provide requested heavy armor for U.S. Rangers in Somalia. The second, William Perry, said that in 1994, although airstrikes are among the options being considered now, I can state categorically that we will not unilaterally conduct airstrikes. We may not conduct them at all. Perry said that he and General John 1000th Shalikashvili, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, took very seriously the limitations of airstrikes against, first of all, artillery-type targets, and second, any targets that are embedded in a civilian population. 95. The Secretary General, 2, continued to oppose the use of air power. Why did the Secretary General oppose the use of force in Bosnia so firmly, even after the Security Council had repeatedly authorized its use? Guard so jealously his power to call in airstrikes and use it so infrequently. In a confidential letter to Christopher, Bout Rosgali offered to spell out the reasons for my misgivings about the U.S. plan for airstrikes at a time and place of NATO's choosing. His argument was simple. The first use of air power in the theater should be initiated by the Secretary General, he claimed, who alone has the right to initiate the use of force. The dual key principle. Perhaps because they did not fully understand what was at stake, the Clinton administration accepted a dual key principle that seriously hampered the ability to use air power. The dual key, or double veto, system required that air power be requested by the UNPROFOR military commander and approved or more often denied by the Secretary General Special Representative Yasushi Akashi. This chain of control was added to the already extremely restrictive rules of engagement, which prevented the use of force for retaliation and provided for no use of force except to provide air cover. In its first few months in office, the Clinton administration formulated a policy on peacekeeping that it outlined in Presidential Decision Directive 13 PDD-13, which provided the rationale for its policies concerning command and control of U.S. forces in peacekeeping operations. The directive and policies reflected the administration's ambivalence about the use of force, and I believe its failure to fully understand that the heavily armed Serbs could be deterred only by much greater force. The directive provided that while the U.S. government retained command over its troops in peacekeeping missions, operational control could be turned over to the UN or some other multilateral body. 96. This command without control principle was also described in the Army Field Manual, which discussed a dual command structure for peacekeeping operations. A U.S. force commander would have two chains of command above him. One chain made him answerable to the U.S. commander-in-chief and integrated him under the UN force commander. Walter Slocum, Deputy Undersecretary for Policy, outlined the complex UNPROFOR chain of command in testimony to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. An UNPROFOR unit commander on the ground initiates a request for close air support through his forward air controller, who is trained in NATO procedures, accompanies the unit to the Air Operations Coordination Center located at the headquarters of UNPROFOR Bosnia. The Coordination Center approves the request. NATO fighter bombers are then dispatched to the location of the unit under attack. Note, however, that the UN Secretary General would have to approve the first request for close air support, that is, the Coordination Center would relay the first request to the Secretary General. NATO has agreed that only the very first request would have to be approved by the UN Secretary General. The Coordination Center would approve subsequent requests for close air support on its own authority. In the case of unproffered troops rotating into Srebrenica or opening Tuzla Airport, the Coordination Center can refer the request for close air support to Mr. Yasushi Akashi, the special representative of the Secretary General to Bosnia-Herzegovina. The UN Secretary General has delegated close air support clearance to him. These procedures for providing close air support to UNPROFOR, which NATO offered last June, are quite different from the procedures to be followed in the case of conducting airstrikes pursuant to the NATO warnings of August 2 and 9, in response to strangulation of Sarajevo or other population centers. In the latter case, the NSC North Atlantic Council and UN authorities would first have to agree that the situation on the ground constitutes strangulation, and both the NSC and UN authorities would have to agree on when and where appropriate airstrikes would be conducted. 97. The dual-key arrangement caused delay and ineffectiveness, but many months passed before it was abandoned in favor of a more effective chain of command. It was never clear why Boutros Ghali thought he had the right to control the use of air power in the first place. No such right had existed previously, certainly not in U.S. experience with wars authorized and carried out by the UN. It was not described in the UN Charter. Resolution 770 stated that the Security Council could take all necessary measures nationally or through regional agencies or arrangements to deliver humanitarian assistance in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but Boutros Ghali interpreted the resolution as authorizing the Security Council to take such measures as requested by the Secretary General. Moreover, he insisted that Resolution 816, which authorized states and regional groups to use force, if necessary to enforce no-fly zones, was contingent on the Secretary General's approval, and that Resolution 836, which authorized member states acting nationally or through regional organizations to use air power to protect UN peacekeepers, only applied if the Secretary General approved. Even after the Security Council had clearly stipulated otherwise, Boutros Ghali claimed that he alone had the authority to initiate the use of force in Bosnia. However, from 1990 through 1993, while hundreds of thousands of Bosnians suffered and died from injuries and lack of food, water, and medicine, he did not use the power he claims, rather he prevented its use. It was a mystery why the Secretary General so consistently opposed the Security Council in providing assistance to the besieged Bosnians, and why the governments that were providing peacekeepers, Britain, France, and the Netherlands among them, accepted his decisions. At a June 1993 NATO meeting I attended, one of Boutros Ghali's top deputies explained to a group of high-level, mainly European officials that in the Secretary General's view, the conflict in Bosnia should be permitted to play itself out, after which the international community should develop plans for reconstruction. He spoke as if he believed governments that stood by passively during the slaughter of Bosnians would later offer economic aid to Serbia and Croatia. The Bosnian government repeatedly pleaded with the United Nations and the United States to lift the arms embargo and help them get weapons with which to defend themselves against the Serbian army and Serb irregulars. Serb shells landed on the safe area of Sarajevo at the rate of 1,000 a day between April 1992 and August 1995, when NATO's Operation Deliberate Force joined the action. Yet the Secretariat called for fulfillment of UNPROFOR's mandate by persuasion and not coercion, and expressed its concern that airstrikes would pose grave dangers to UNPROFOR and the humanitarian convoys, and therefore it should be initiated with the greatest restraint and, essentially, in self-defense. 98. After consulting with the UN Secretary General and the commanders of NATO and the North Atlantic Council NSC, NATO Secretary General Manfred Warner called for stronger measures, stressing the importance of maintaining the distinction between defensive close air support and offensive air strikes. Warner interpreted Resolutions 836 and 844 as permitting the use of air power in self-defense in response to bombardments of safe areas, in response to armed incursions into safe areas, and in response to Serb efforts to obstruct the movement of UNPROFOR forces or humanitarian convoys. After the attack on the market in Sarajevo in February 1994, Warner suggested that the accumulation of Security Council mandates had transformed the task, making UNPROFOR more of a player in the struggle. Warner warned that attacks in the Sarajevo, Gorest, and Bihać safe areas demonstrated that Serbs were not deterred by the demarcation of safe areas, their demilitarization, or negotiations. He added, the recent experience in Bihać has demonstrated once again the inherent shortcomings of the current safe area concept at the expense of the civilian population who have found themselves in a pitiable plight. 99. General Sir Michael Rose, designated as the next UN 100 commander for the area, arrived in Bosnia soon after the market attack. Although Sarajevo was supposed to be a safe area, attacks on the civilian population continued unabated. General Rose was able to slow or stop the shelling of Sarajevo with an impermanent ceasefire in February 1994, but he seemed almost unconcerned about the continuing attacks on Gorest, another safe haven whose population was being decimated. UN military observers reported that as many as 70,000 people were trapped inside Gorest, where up to half the houses had been destroyed. Gorest was the last fortified town in Serb-controlled East Bosnia. The attacks were described in some detail by a BC correspondent Peter Jennings and other journalists in the area who spotlighted the conditions in Gorest, where approximately 65,000 Muslims had gathered after being driven out of smaller towns in eastern Bosnia. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees reported 700 dead and 2,000 wounded in the area. Rose said flatly that the figures were exaggerated because the Bosnians want us to fight their war for them. I've long since ceased to believe the first reports I hear in this country. 101. Rose sent a Canadian observer to verify the reports, but instead of supporting Rose's doubts, the observer confirmed that a major offensive was underway with many casualties. But although Rose had the power and responsibility to call in NATO planes, and the American General Leighton Smith was ready with planes and targets, Rose chose not to accept Smith's recommendation for more robust air attacks. He told Peter Jennings, we are not there to impose a political or military solution on any party as peacekeepers. That is not a war-fighting mission. We are not there as war fighters. 102. When Rose finally called in airstrikes against the Serbs attacking Gorest, the strikes were so mild as to be harmless. Airstrikes were a long time coming. The groundwork had been laid in August 1992 when the Security Council passed Resolution 770 authorizing member states to take all necessary measures to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian relief to Bosnia. In October 1992, Resolution 781 imposed a ban on military flights over Bosnia-Herzegovina but did not provide for enforcement. In November, Resolution 786 described the Secretary General's plan to monitor the no-fly zone. In March 1993, Resolution 816 authorized but did not instruct member states to enforce the no-fly zone. In August, Resolution 836 authorized UNPROFOR to take necessary measures, including the use of force in reply to bombardments against the safe areas, and decided that member states, in coordination with the Secretary and UNPROFOR, could take all necessary measures through the use of air power in and around the safe areas to provide support for UNPROFOR 103. By the fall, typhoid was spreading in the overcrowded refugee camps, even as fresh assaults by Serbian forces were creating new Muslim and Croatian refugees. In Croatia, Serb irregulars terrorized unarmed civilians in a new campaign of ethnic cleansing in towns previously pacified under a UN-sponsored peace plan. In Kosovo, the Serbs tightened the screws on the Muslim majority, many of whom abandoned their homes and possessions to seek refuge in Albania, a country whose meager resources were already strained. As winter came to the region, snow and ice blocked the fleeing families. A week before Christmas, NATO agreed to support the United States if it decided to enforce the ban on Serbian flights over Bosnia. The previous summer, the United States had contributed 315 U.S. personnel and equipment to the UN peacekeeping operations and had been keeping U.S. ships in the Adriatic to help enforce the blockade. 104 at the beginning of 1994, Secretary General Boutros Ghali hinted that the UN was ready to use air power to achieve some relief for the Bosnians, but UN and NATO forces stood by while their planes were shot from the sky. The problem was not with the soldiers or pilots, it was with their mission, their rules of engagement, and, above all, with the UN Secretary General and his special representative, Yasashi Akashi. Clinton's policy in Bosnia had one virtue: it did not commit lightly armed U.S. forces to a war zone under UN rules of engagement. Clinton stuck to his decision that Americans would participate as ground forces in peacekeeping in Bosnia only when a ceasefire had been agreed to by all parties to the conflict. After the traumatic experience in Mogadishu in October 1993, Clinton understood that peacekeeping could be dangerous when there was no peace to keep, but he was not yet ready to use adequate force. I wondered why not, given the failure of peace operations in Somalia, Haiti, Rwanda, and especially Bosnia. In Bosnia and Croatia, the UN peacekeepers had served principally to inhibit energetic resistance to the Serb attackers. They had not prevented the sieges and destruction of the safe haven towns Srebrenica, Tuzla, Sarajevo, and Gorazd on the eastern side of Serbia. Sometimes they had not even tried. The UN Secretariat tried intermittently to negotiate ceasefires to prevent the complete destruction of one civilian population after another. Sometimes the threat of anti-NATO air interventions persuaded Serbian forces to move their big guns onto another town and another target. Sometimes it had no effect at all. Humanitarian relief was not what civilians under bombardment most desperately needed. They needed weapons and allies. There was a great deal of confusion in diplomatic and UN circles regarding appropriate measures of response to Serbian aggression, but Article 15 in the UN Charter could not be clearer. All states have an inherent, unalienable right to defend themselves against aggression and to call on others to help them. Kuwait called for help when Iraq attacked and got it. Bosnia-Herzegovina called for help when it was attacked by Serbia and the Bosnian Serbs, but all it got was an arms embargo. The UN rules of engagement protected no one. Security against the Serbian aggressors could not be provided by peacekeepers who drew their guns only in defense of their own lives. But the Secretary General was little more to blame for the situation than the UN member states that accepted those rules. The military commanders provided by France, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and the Netherlands understood that very different tactics were required to help the Bosnians. The United States, the UN, and NATO could have lifted the arms embargo. In fact, the state for which the embargo was created, Yugoslavia, no longer existed. But the European members of UNPROFOR were unwilling to lift it as long as they had troops in the region. The United Kingdom, France, the United States, and other allies could have granted NATO the authority to enforce no-fly zones and safe havens and protect those delivering humanitarian assistance. But those things had not happened, so no one expected much from the decision to use NATO air power in Bosnia, especially after the defeat of a resolution to exempt Bosnia from the arms embargo. That resolution won only 6 of the 9 votes needed to pass. Cape Verde, Djibouti, Morocco, Pakistan, the United States, and Venezuela voted in favor of the resolution. Brazil, China, France, Hungary, Japan, New Zealand, the Russian Federation, and the United Kingdom abstained. France and the United Kingdom spoke against ending the embargo. Boutros Ghali's power grab. When the heads of state at the NATO summit decided to use air power to open Sarajevo and other Bosnian towns under siege, the Secretary General responded by asserting that he alone had the authority to decide when the first air strike could be made in any engagement. In a meeting with the Foreign Relations Committee of the French Parliament in Paris, Boutros Ghali claimed that the Security Council gave him this extraordinary authority, which he refused to either use or delegate to the UN commander, the French General Jean Cot, the previous commander. The Belgian General Francis Bricquemont had resigned his command the week before, complaining of inadequate resources and authority. Cot, too, eventually went public with his frustrations, telling Le Monde that he had repeatedly requested the authority to call in airstrikes, only to be turned down by Boutros Ghali. 105 It is not for generals to ask me for the authorization, the Secretary General asserted haughtily. It is for the Special Representative. If the Special Representative requests it, I will be the first to accede to this demand. The position of Special Representative held by Yasashi Akashi does not exist in the UN Charter. He was appointed by and responsible to the Secretary General and had no military competence. Of course, it was not the first time Boutros Ghali had claimed such power. Yet none of the Security Council resolutions he cited 770, 816, and 836 supported his position. None of these resolutions mandated bypassing the military commanders or delegated the decision to use air power to the Secretary General. None required his authorization. On the contrary, the UN Charter vests all decisions concerning the use of force in the Security Council and the military forces of member states. Neither the Charter nor the Security Council makes the Secretary General the supreme commander of military operation. Although Boutros Ghali himself was unsuited by training and experience to exercise such powers, he doggedly sought to prevent NATO from using the air power authorized by the Security Council. His actions had terrible consequences for Bosnia, virtually ending all hope of establishing collective security or effective deterrence of aggression through the UN. He undermined the UN's capacity to act, challenged the member states' right of collective self-defense, and denied the capacity of the Security Council to decide when aggression had occurred and when a serious threat to international peace and security existed. The Secretary General claimed nothing less than a personal veto over the legitimate use of force. It was the most sweeping power grab in the history of international organizations. It should have been firmly rebuffed, but it was not. When the heads of state of the Anatio governments announced that they would use Anatio's air power to lift the sieges on Sarajevo, Tuzla, Gorest, and Srebrenica, they seemed decisive and credible, but all too soon it became clear that few of them actually expected airstrikes to take place. The pretense that significant action has been taken when nothing has really happened was a characteristic of the UN style in Bosnia and in subsequent international crises. American pilots were fully prepared to carry out the airstrikes, but there was no agreement on their authorization to do so. The same governments that Boutros-Ghali claimed had given him a veto over airstrikes could have withdrawn that power. Yet the Secretary General's military power was simply accepted by key governments, notably the United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands. If there were no airstrikes to save the starving inhabitants of Sarajevo, Tuzla, Gorest, Srebrenica, and other safe areas, it was because the British, French, Dutch, and American governments did not act. Instead, the leaders of the Western world tried to work out a response to Serbia's savage violence that was acceptable to Serbia. Christopher sought the approval of French Foreign Minister Alain Juppé, who sought the approval of Christopher and British Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd. Consensus was the central value in a situation where humanitarian concerns should have dominated. A month passed as the struggle for consensus continued. After careful consultation with Milosevic and Karadzic, the Secretary General finally proposed a solution for Tuzla. He suggested that Bosnian forces should surrender the Tuzla airport and that the Serbs should be permitted to place monitors at the airport to ensure that no military use was made of it. If more violence occurred, the Secretary General would authorize his special representative to approve a request to Anatio for close air support from the UNPROF or commander, with the understanding that close air support did not imply punitive or preemptive air attacks. Thus, surrender of more Bosnian territory would be a condition of the delivery of humanitarian assistance. The Secretary General continued to resist the effective use of force long after it had been authorized by Security Council resolutions. He was a major obstacle to saving the Bosnians. 106. On February 5, 1994, Serb artillery fired into a market in the heart of Sarajevo, leaving 68 dead and 200 wounded. The ground was littered with bodies and pieces of bodies like a butcher shop. By this time, Serb shells had been battering Sarajevo for 22 months. The market had been bombed once before, in 1992. A local journalist said, "Here in Sarajevo, we have been deceived once again. Promises of planes, food, and aid have been broken. Having lied to us, the criminals have continued to destroy Zepet, Sarajevo, Mostar, Jablanica, and Gorest. As well as monuments, they have destroyed history, hope, and goodness. It is their aim to destroy everything down to the last Bosnian." 107. In Washington, Paris, Brussels, and London, Western leaders told one another that something must be done. This time, the Secretary General seemed to agree. In a February 7 letter, he asked Anatio to launch airstrikes on artillery positions around Sarajevo if they were requested by the United Nations. 108. Did this mean that Anatio would function under the command of Boutros-Ghali? The U.S. Congress would support airstrikes as long as Anatio planes remained under Anatio's control, not the UN's. The European Union EU issued another declaration that suggested it was ready to support the use of air power, although it did not specify airstrikes, and Boutros-Ghali had insisted on a distinction between the two. The new U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry said, "I can state categorically that we will not unilaterally conduct airstrikes." No fact-finding mission was required to determine that a member state of the United Nations had been the object of savage aggression. No further action by the Security Council was required to authorize whatever steps were necessary, including airstrikes, to end the strangulation of Sarajevo, Tuzla, Srebrenica, Zepa, and the other Bosnian safe areas. All that was required was that the Anatio countries had the will to use the powers they had been given. A little more than 3 weeks later, on February 28, American pilots and F-16 fighters operating from Anatio base in Avano, Italy, under the command of Admiral Jeremy 1000, boarded senior Anatio commander for Southern Europe, twice warned Serb planes in positions around Gorest to leave. When 4 Serb planes persisted in violating the no-fly zone, the Americans shot them down. This was the first Anatio military engagement in its 45-year history. "If it was a test, I think we passed," Admiral Borda said. 109. Yet the fact that the American planes came from Anatio base made U.S. officials nervous, and they took unusual steps to assure the Russian government that the incident was not intended as a hostile act toward Moscow. According to New York Times report, Thomas Pickering, the American ambassador to Moscow, was dispatched to convey the message personally to a representative of President Boris N. Yeltsin. 110. If crimes go unpunished, by 1994, more and more Americans were convinced that compelling moral and strategic reasons existed for caring about Bosnia. By then, more than 100,000 Bosnians had been killed in the war, and more than 1.6 million people had been driven from their homes and villages. Many Americans believed that the United States could not remain indifferent to such pain without brutalizing ourselves, that we could not deny empathy to the Bosnians without dehumanizing them, and thus it seemed ever clearer that our indifference to their suffering would encourage their tormentors and others. As Sigmund Freud argued in Civilization and its Discontents, crimes that go unpunished only incite other crimes and incite others to commit crimes. Commentators referred to the lessons of Hitler's seizure of the Rhineland, Mussolini's seizure of Ethiopia, and Neville Chamberlain's capitulation at Munich, which showed that ignoring, appeasing, and even rewarding aggression encourages more aggression. The strategic argument for caring about Bosnia was as clear as the moral argument. The pattern of aggression and expansion in which Serbia had already engaged in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Macedonia, and toward Vojvodina, Kosovo, and Albania made it clear that Serb leaders were operating from a large appetite and an ambitious strategic plan that was especially dangerous at a time of great instability in Central and Eastern Europe. Restricted to Serbia, Milosevic was a tyrant. Permitted to expand, he would prepare the way for other tyrants. Bosnia's fate had special significance for another reason. It was a test of the ability of the United States, the UN, and the EU, and the CSCE to cope with an aggressor. By establishing diplomatic relations with Bosnia and admitting it to the UN, the United States and the EU had endowed it with the legitimacy and rights of states in the contemporary world. If they could not make collective security work for Bosnia, there was no reason to think they could make it work anywhere else. Bosnia was an especially important test for the United States, the UN, and the EU. When the Security Council imposed an arms embargo that deprived Bosnia of the right to self-defense, it assumed responsibility for the defense. Again and again, the Security Council adopted resolutions promising the delivery of humanitarian assistance, the establishment of safe zones, and the protection of Bosnian towns against strangulation by sieges and annihilation from the air. The credibility of the major powers and of collective security itself were at stake. Bosnia was also a test for the American government, which had assumed a special responsibility for the collective security structures constructed after World War II. We had planned them, vouched for them, and come to believe our own assurances. But the elaborate architecture of collective security was not proving up to the challenge. An international failure in Bosnia would be our failure as well. Finally, Bosnia had become a test of the Russian-American relationship in which the Bush and Clinton administrations had invested much. Russia's unexpected demand for a major role in a Bosnian settlement suddenly gave the problem a new great powers dimension. But effective action proved elusive. In the meantime, the UN peacekeepers suffered continued attacks, demonstrating how Boutros-Ghali's determination to control the use of force by UN troops had hamstrung operations. Take the following case, by no means unique. At 6:30 p.m. one evening in the fall of 1994, a Serb attack pinned down French peacekeepers near Bihać. At 7 p.m., the peacekeepers called the UN commander for Bosnia, General Michael Rose, at his headquarters with a request for air support. At 8:30 p.m., the request was transmitted to General Jean Kott, UN commander for the former Yugoslavia. At 10:40 p.m., Kott transmitted the request to the Secretary-General's Special Representative Yasushi Akashi. A spokesman for the UN Secretariat claimed that the authorization for air strikes was granted at 11:35 p.m., but that weather conditions made the strikes impossible. According to Anatio's spokesman, the UN authorization never came despite that French forces were in clear danger and Anatio planes were overhead. After several such episodes, including one a week later in which a French soldier was killed, French Prime Minister Edouard Balladur and Defense Minister François Léotard visited French forces in Bosnia, where Balladur demanded the procedures be promptly and definitively revised so that reinforcements could be provided when they were needed. But, said Foreign Minister Alain Juppé, the problem is not only delay, it is also will. One does not get the impression that UN representatives on the ground, those who represent the Secretary-General of the United Nations, have a firm determination to use force each time that is necessary. Bihać was by no means an isolated problem. On February 22, 1994, Swedish peacekeeping troops near Tuzla came under heavy mortar attack and requested Anatio air cover. General Rose relayed the request to General Kott, who was away. Kott's chief of staff presented the request to Akashi, who turned it down, saying the encounter was not serious enough to warrant Anatio airstrike. 5 Swedish peacekeepers were wounded. General Kott went public with the complaint that he repeatedly asked for airstrikes to protect UN forces, only to have his request turned down by the UN representative on the ground. He made it clear that the situation of Bosnian towns under siege did not improve after Anatio decided to undertake airstrikes because the Secretary-General's cumbersome rules of engagement and chain of command prevented the effective use of air power. The French ambassador to the UN demanded that the power to call for air support be vested in military commanders. In Washington, Secretary of Defense William Perry agreed, describing the decision-making process as torturous and insisting that there must be a more streamlined command authority. Perry noted that Security Council resolutions permitted UN military commanders to request help directly from Anatio headquarters and stated his expectation that in the future they would do so. It was past time for the governments participating in UNPROFOR to assume responsibility for the security of their forces and the success of their operations. They needed to recognize that the Secretary-General had neither the military expertise nor the authority to exercise command and control. The UN Charter vests authority over military operations in the Security Council, and the Security Council had already authorized the use of force in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 3 resolutions. Resolution 770 provided that all necessary measures could be taken nationally or through regional agencies or arrangements to deliver humanitarian assistance in Bosnia-Herzegovina. That meant that Anatio could use necessary force to deliver food and medicine to civilian populations under siege. No further authorization was required. Resolution 816 authorized states and regional groups to use necessary means to enforce no-fly zones. No further authorization was required. Resolution 819 authorized member states acting nationally or through regional organizations or arrangements to use air power to protect UN peacekeepers. That meant that Anatio, for example, or France or the United States, was authorized to provide air strikes to protect peacekeepers when they came under attack. No further authorization was required. Sometimes it seemed that Boutros-Ghali understood this. In a meeting with the Committee on Foreign Relations at the French Chamber of Deputies on January 11, 1994, he was asked, if tonight or tomorrow Anatio formally decides to undertake air strikes, what will be your attitude? Will you support the demand? He waffled, replying, I don't have this power. It is for the Security Council to accept or refuse, to authorize or not to authorize. It can give a mandate to Anatio or not give a mandate. It is for them to decide. Yet Boutros-Ghali continued his inept efforts to micromanage military matters. In midwinter of 1994, for example, he replaced a French unit that had been in the Bihać area for months with Bangladeshi troops who were new to the region, inadequately armed and trained, and not supplied with winter clothing or footwear. Several Bangladeshi soldiers were immediately captured. 349 UN peacekeepers were being held hostage throughout Bosnia. At that time, the Serb officers promised to cease harassing Bangladeshi forces only if NATO ceased its air strikes against Serb forces. The captured Bangladeshi soldiers were bound, gagged, and forced to remain on an airfield without food or water for many hours. One soldier died of bronchitis, asthma, and exposure. More hostages were taken, including a Jordanian major who also became ill and died. Because the area was under siege, it was not possible to quickly provide warm clothes. Those who fell ill were denied medical treatment. 3 UNPROFOR hostages were tied on the runway of the Banja Luka airport for 8 hours in November 1994 after Anatio airstrike targeted a Croatian airfield. Several UN observers in Croatia were denied food for 24 hours at a stretch. 111. If Boutros-Ghali recognized that the authorization lay not with him but with the Security Council, why did he so often insist otherwise? The explanation, I believe, lies in the Secretary-General's ceaseless efforts to increase his power. These efforts had become a huge obstacle to effective peacekeeping and war-making. His redefinition of the peacekeeping mission and the UN rules of engagement sent lightly armed forces into war zones with no reliable arrangements for reinforcement or defense. This is what happened to French, Swedish, and Bangladeshi troops in Bosnia. It was the U.S. government's acceptance of such rules of engagement for NATO operations that allowed Bosnian Serb forces to shoot down an American F-16 and its pilot, Captain Scott O'Grady, on June 2, 1995. O'Grady was ultimately saved by his own initiative, stamina, and good luck, and by the determined efforts of his rescuers. 112 in the days after the F-16 was shot down, the U.S. government neither retaliated nor expressed much outrage over this deliberate targeting of an unprotected U.S. plane on a routine nonviolent mission. 113 The Clinton administration gave no one, including the offending Serbs, any reason to fear American displeasure. The Serbs had been permitted to install the SAM missile batteries that brought down O'Grady's plane in the area patrolled by American planes. Then U.S. planes were sent up without the protection of readily available, highly effective electronic equipment that provides notice to fighter pilots that they are being targeted by missiles. It was past time for the members of the Security Council to accept responsibility not just for providing troops, but also for ensuring adequate weapons, realistic rules of engagement, and competent military commanders. The essential elements of the Bosnian conflict were changing. On August 28, 1995, the Bosnian Serbs carried out a third brutal attack on Sarajevo. Abandoning its usual neutral posture, the Security Council declared that beyond a reasonable doubt the Bosnian Serbs were responsible. The Secretary General, who habitually opposed the use of force regardless of the provocation, flatly condemned the attack. UN peacekeepers quietly left Gorez to ensure that they would not be taken hostage. The NATO attacks continued and intensified. From September 10, 1995, 3,400 sorties were flown. Communication and transportation resources and military stores were targeted. At the same time, the now adequately armed Croatian and Bosnian forces began to sweep Serb forces out of land they had captured. Both Croats and Muslims wanted to keep fighting, but Washington insisted that the war should end. After the second wave of bombing hit Sarajevo in February 1994, Christopher signaled to our associates that we would act only in conjunction with them, asserting their atrocities on all sides. A new joint action plan was organized by the United States, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and Spain as a containment plan. It called for sealing Bosnia's borders and establishing Muslim-safe areas. Clinton himself became active in the search for a settlement and was prepared to settle for a three-way partition with terms dictated by Serbs and Croats. The United States undertook the effort to negotiate peace and a unified state, but was unable to do so. In fact, a war seemed likely between the Muslims and the Croats. For a while, Muslims permitted the Serb forces JN to assume a number of policing functions. Then cooperation between Croats and Muslims broke down almost entirely. And the Croats, while still formally allied with the Muslims, effectively became allies of the Serbs. They were complicit in some of their most brutal attacks, including the siege of Srebrenica, and participated in creating more refugees and more misery for the Muslims. Croat militia members murdered dozens of Muslim civilians in Amasai and other villages. Milosevic and Croatian President Franjo Tudjman plotted settlements that would leave less and less land for Muslims and press them into smaller and smaller areas. In March 1994, under pressure from Washington, Bosnian Muslims and Croats stopped fighting and agreed to form a federation. Cooperation between these two republics of former Yugoslavia got underway after Tudjman transmitted a message that Iran was ready to ship arms to Bosnia. The Clinton administration quietly acquiesced, without informing its allies or Congress. Arms shipments began in April 1994, and from that point on, Bosnian forces received a steady supply. The U.S. government delivered no arms itself, but covert support was given by Islamic nations including Iran. The arms were accompanied by small but increasing numbers of mujahideen. The Bosnians undertook offensives that opened roads to Tuzla and defeated Serbs in Bihać, which was under heavy shelling. Soon the newly armed Bosnian forces began to win battles and undertake more military initiatives. Croatia and Bosnia won battle after battle, and by 1995 controlled most of Krajina. Tension over the continued lack of a UN response to Serbian aggression had been building, with Americans calling for more vigorous use of air power, implementation of the Security Council resolutions, and more determined use of force to punish and deter the attacks. Congress had made repeated calls to lift the arms embargo and permit Bosnia to defend itself. As 1994 drew to a close, it seemed clear that it would not be easy to heal the rift between the U.S. government and its NATO allies in the matter of Bosnia. The NATO military operation, which had been underway since April, revealed differences that were broader, deeper, more unpleasant, and more important than anticipated. Many Americans had been surprised by how passively the British and French greeted the carnage in Bosnia and by Boutros-Ghali's opposition to the use of force to stop the brutal aggression. These differences would not be easily overcome, nor would the differences between the United Nations and its critics, Congress. In November 1994, against European objections, the Clinton administration announced that it would no longer enforce the arms embargo. That same month, Republicans won control of Congress. Majority Leader Robert Dole and House Speaker Newt Gingrich announced their support for the lift-and-strike policy and noted that a congressional majority supported their position. The following month, former President Jimmy Carter negotiated a 4-month ceasefire. At its end, the Bosnian and Croatian governments undertook more military offensives after the Serbs attacked safe areas and took several hundred UNPROFOR troops hostage. UN negotiators struck a deal with the Serbs to release the hostages in exchange for promise that there would be no more NATO airstrikes against Serb forces. Each of the principals had his own priorities and goals. Radovan Karadzic, leader of the Bosnian Serbs, understood that his forces and resources were dangerously thin and that he was likely to be betrayed by Milosevic, whom he accused of treason. "You have turned your back on the Serbs," he charged, having concluded that Milosevic would do nothing to help them. He was right. Milosevic was ready to abandon the Bosnian Serbs as part of his plan to achieve the lifting of the sanctions in Serbia imposed since 1992. The Croatians were preoccupied with extending their control over Krajina, an area that Clinton's national security advisor, Anthony Lake, had targeted as a center of a future state of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which he was eager to cobble together out of the Muslim-Croat Federation and the Bosnian Serb Ministry. Richard Holbrooke, the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, understood that the task of dealing with Milosevic was his, and he relied principally on American air power and tough talk. Milosevic was furious with the Bosnian Serbs and warned them that he was ready to cut them off. Finally, and very reluctantly, the Bosnian Serbs agreed that Milosevic could negotiate for them. NATO began heavy bombing on August 31, 1995, flying 34 sorties against the Bosnian Serbs over a period of 2 weeks. Milosevic asked the contact group to stop the bombing. In return, Hallberg asked Milosevic to accept a division of Bosnia-Herzegovina into two parts, with the Muslim Croat Federation taking 51% and the Bosnian Serbs 49%. When Bosnian Serb General Ratko Mladic and Karadzic rejected the idea, Hallberg walked out. Milosevic told Mladic and Karadzic that NATO would destroy their forces if they continued to hold out against Hallberg's proposal. Then, just as it appeared that the conference was about to break up, leaving Croatia and Bosnia in a stronger position, Washington applied more pressure, this time leaving Mladic and Karadzic to face the prospect of fighting alone. In November 1995, when the United States and the other contact group members finally brought the warring factions together for peace talks, the Croats' top priority was eastern Slovenia. The Bosnian Serbs were determined to split Sarajevo. Slajic refused to meet with them and told Milosevic he wanted Gorest as a symbol of Bosnian presence on the Serbian border. Milosevic capitulated. There would be 3 states, 1 Serb, 1 Croat, and 1 Muslim. The 4-month-long truce helped, but it did not prevent repeated attacks in Bosnian safe areas. The next month, another Anatio bombing led to Serb withdrawal from Gorest and marked the end of the total vulnerability of the Bosnian Muslim. In Bosnia, clashes continued between the Americans and the Secretary General's special representative. One incident concerned Gorest. NATO had declared a deadline of April 23 for the Bosnian Serbs to pull back their troops, but when the Serbs failed to comply, Akashi blocked the promised NATO airstrikes. The United States complained that Akashi allowed Bosnian Serb tanks through to Sarajevo in clear violation of an understanding that no tanks would be permitted in the city. Clinton's distaste for U.S. unilateral force. The long-awaited Anatio airstrikes and Serb positions around Gorest, which began on April 10, 1994, demonstrated that the White House was ready to use limited air power to achieve limited objectives. But President Clinton's comments on the strikes sounded more like a disclaimer than a statement of purpose. This is a clear expression of the will of Anatio and the will of the United Nations, he said, as if the United States had no voice or responsibility in these decisions. We have said we would act if we were requested to do so. We have now done so, and we will do so again if we are requested. 114.1 can only wonder why Clinton chose these words. Did he regard the American pilot's mission in Gorest as more legitimate if it was specifically authorized by the UN? Was he trying to suggest that attacks by American pilots and American planes should be seen not as Americans but as representatives of a multinational force acting on behalf of a multinational body? Clinton's language was a clear reminder that many of his key advisors had a long-standing distaste for unilateral American use of force and put their faith instead in a policy of active global multilateralism. Among the most prominent statements of this policy was the 1992 essay Military Action, When to Use It and How to Ensure Its Effectiveness by William Perry, soon to become Clinton Secretary of Defense. In the essay, which developed themes from an earlier article he co-authored with Ashton Carter, then Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy, and John Steinbrenner of the Brookings Institution, Perry advocated renouncing the use of American force in favor of a policy of global engagement through an international police force. Perry's recommendations were straightforward. All nations should reduce their military forces to those required for defense of their own territory except for the United States and a few other major states, who would maintain some additional forces to supplement multinational forces as needed. Any new international aggression would then be deterred by those multinational forces rather than any individual state. Though Pentagon spokesman denied that Perry would follow its prescriptions as Secretary of Defense, their relevance to his performance was obvious. Perry's proposals resembled those of other members of the Clinton team, including Morton Halperin then at the National Security Council, who recommended that U.S. armed forces be drastically reduced and the unilateral use of force renounced. Like Perry, he looked to multinational forces to meet the occasional challenges created by outlaw states. Halperin emphasized that the United States should act in the world through the UN, and he expected that national defense would become the defense of world peace. Peace, he anticipated, would be protected mainly by the moral force of a united world community. The threat of military force should be sufficient to obviate the need to use it if the right military and political conditions are met, Perry wrote. 115. The vision of investing less in national defense and more in international peacekeeping was emphasized in the pronouncements of various Clinton officials. In a June 1995 speech before the Philadelphia Bar Association, Madeleine Albright emphasized and, I think, exaggerated the diverse tasks that could be performed by a UN peacekeeping operation, which, she said, could separate adversaries, maintain ceasefires, facilitate the delivery of humanitarian relief, enable refugees and displaced persons to find homes, demobilize combatants, and create conditions under which political reconciliation may occur and free elections may be held. It can help to nurture new democracies, lower the global tide of refugees, reduce the likelihood of unwelcome interventions by regional powers, prevent small wars from growing into larger conflict. 160. Spurred on by this vision, American participation in peacekeeping had spread rapidly into all the areas where the Clinton administration found cost to use force to achieve a goal. In the meantime, the costs of these missions were mounting. On March 8, 1995, the General Accounting Office (GAO) reported to the House of Representatives the United States had deployed the following troops: 26,000 troops to the peacekeeping mission in Somalia, 14,000 troops to monitor repression of the population in southern Iraq, 11,700 troops to enforce the arms embargo in former Yugoslavia, 20,000 troops on what the Clinton team called returning Haiti to democracy, 2,000 troops to enforce the no-fly zone in Bosnia-Herzegovina, 1,000 troops to help provide humanitarian assistance in Bosnia, 1,500 troops for the security of safe havens for the population in northern Iraq. Yes, the number, size, and scope of peace operations have increased dramatically in the past several years. The GAO report observed the nature and extent of U.S. participation have changed markedly. Recently, the United States has used much larger numbers of combat and support forces to respond to events in a number of locations. The title of the report, Peace Operations, Heavy Use of Key Capabilities May Affect Response to Regional Conflicts. 117. More busy non-response. For all the expenditures the U.S. government was making around the world, however, the international response to Bosnia was still anemic compared to the challenges it faced. It takes a strong stomach to watch a town encircled, its population swollen with refugees bombed, strafed, and picked off by snipers, its crowded hospitals targeted, its water and electricity cut, and its inhabitants denied the food and medicine waiting for them just beyond the big guns. Yet time and again, this is exactly what the UN and NATO forces managed to do: stand by and wait while the Serbs surrounded Bosnian towns. As embodied in 1993's PDD-13, the Clinton administration's policy committed the United States to broader participation in global peacekeeping. The discussions regarding this participation raised many questions, because in Bosnia, for example, peacekeepers had repeatedly inhibited efforts to protect Bosnians rather than inhibiting Serbian attackers. Only determined action could have stopped the spread of violence in the former Yugoslavia and restored credibility to the UN. It was clear that continuation of the feckless policies applied thus far in Bosnia would negate the idea of collective security for another generation. But NATO's belated decision to resist Serb violations of UN declared safe areas, including Sarajevo, provoked a violent Serb reaction. For months, the UN forces had tolerated Serbs blocking the delivery of food and medicine and reclaiming their heavy weapons from UN custody. But eventually the situation of UN peacekeepers and the civilian Bosnian population had deteriorated so badly that action was required. On May 25, 1995, NATO planes dropped bombs on Serb ammunition dumps near Pale. Although the targets had no military importance, the bombing enraged Bosnian Serb leaders, who responded with rocket attacks in downtown Tuzla that killed 70 civilians. Serb shelling of Sarajevo was stepped up and serious hostage-taking began. In June 1995, a group of Bosnian Serbs dressed in stolen French uniforms and the blue berets of UN peacekeepers infiltrated UN lines, seized a bridge in Sarajevo, and stole a half-dozen UN tanks, 24 armored personnel carriers, and assorted other vehicles and supplies. By week's end, the Serbs held 400 hostages, mainly British and French UN peacekeepers. Many of the hostages were chained in exposed positions as human shields to prevent another NATO raid. 118 The foreign ministers of France, Germany, Great Britain, the United States, and Russia, who happened to be meeting, called this an outrageous act. The French proposed an international rapid reaction force to reinforce the peacekeepers. The British dispatched another 1,500 troops and put additional troops on alert. Clinton spoke of sending American ground forces to help evacuate or reposition UN troops. Defense Secretary Perry said that U.S. ground forces might be sent only as part of a NATO operation in order to extract UN forces that are in danger. Such an operation, he said, would have to be under NATO command and authorized by Congress. A few days earlier, on May 26, NATO Secretary General Willie Cleese had made clear that airstrikes would come only at the request of the UN and for the purpose of helping peacekeepers. NATO has no intention to take sides in the conflict, he said, but will continue to act within the framework of the UN Security Council resolutions and the ongoing efforts of the international community to achieve a negotiated solution. It was another ludicrous invocation of NATO neutrality. Cleese also said that NATO's actions were precipitated by persistent and flagrant violations of the safe areas by the Bosnian Serbs and represent a threat to the viability of the UN mission and a challenge to the will and the credibility of the international community. Finally, after 48 hours of delay, the Security Council passed a resolution authorizing NATO to take necessary measures to enforce the no-fly zone, subject to close coordination with the Secretary General and the UN peacekeeping forces. With the UN resolution in hand, the permission of the President of Croatia, and a resolution passed by the 16 ambassadors to NATO, Cleese instructed General Bertrand I. Laprale, the military commander of UN forces in Bosnia, to take appropriate military action. After consultation with the Secretary General's special representative, NATO authorized a limited attack on the Serb airstrip in Croatia, taking care not to destroy Serbian planes, hangars, or vehicles. This was not exactly decisive force. Admiral Leighton W. Smith, NATO commander in Southern Europe, said of the raid, "If I wanted to put that airfield out of commission and to make sure nothing ever took off from it again, we would have taken out all the aircraft. We would have hit their ammunition dumps, and we would have taken out all the buildings anywhere around that airfield." The half-hearted attack only emboldened the Serbs. Concluding that NATO was incapable of acting forcefully, Serb forces resumed their attacks, bombarding Bihać and the surrounding villages again with tanks and a helicopter gunship. Surface-to-air missiles were fired at British planes, and no significant NATO response was forthcoming. Bihać was soon completely surrounded. French Foreign Minister Alain Juppé said the events in Bosnia raised serious doubts about whether NATO could ensure European security in the post-Cold War world. Never has NATO appeared so little capable of maintaining security on the old continent. Never have events in Bosnia shown it in so bad a light. Spring and summer of 1995. By the spring of 1995, 3 Muslim towns that had been declared safe zones in 1993 remained outside the control of the Bosnian Serbs: Srebrenica, Zepa, and Goraz. They had been shelled and starved, and were full of refugees from the surrounding towns. Each had given up its weapons as the price for becoming a safe area under UN protection. They were protected by a skeleton crew of 24 Dutch soldiers, who were themselves surrounded by well-armed Serb troops. The NTS that followed in the spring and summer of 1995 have been investigated by the Dutch and French parliaments, various journalists and scholars seeking to understand what led to the mass murder of some 8,000 men and boys in Srebrenica, and the rape and brutalization of many of the girls and women. The details of the massacre of Srebrenica are so horrific that in 2002, after reviewing a report on the incident, the entire Dutch cabinet resigned in shame. 119 Someone must take responsibility for the thousands killed in the massacre, one official said, and no one else was willing to do so. On July 6, 1995, the Serbs moved on Srebrenica, mounting a fierce attack with tanks and artillery. The Dutch commander made a series of requests for close air support, first in Sarajevo, then in Srebrenica. Supposedly, the commander was told by the UN that NATO planes would soon arrive to conduct airstrikes, but NATO planes were never called in. Later investigations indicated that Akashi, who reported directly to Bout Rosgali, did not inform him or other top UN officials of the requests. On the afternoon of July 6, approximately 20,000 persons, mainly women, children, and old people, converged on the Dutch headquarters in Srebrenica demanding airstrikes, but there were no calls and no airstrikes. The commander cut a hole in the fence, and 4,000 to 5,000 people came through under the illusion that it was safer inside the compound than outside it. Another 14,000 to 15,000 refugees remained outside the compound. Thousands more unarmed refugees sought to make their way to Tuzla. On July 8, the Dutch peacekeepers abandoned 3 posts under direct fire and again requested airstrikes. On July 10, close air support was finally requested. On July 11, the Serbs took control of Srebrenica. Mladic insisted that Muslim boys and men between the ages of 17 and 60 must be disarmed and then questioned one by one. He said they would be well treated. In fact, virtually all of them were slaughtered. On August 8, the massacres were described in a Newsday article. On August 10, Ambassador Madeleine Albright showed her UN colleagues aerial photographs of Bosnian Serbs killing hundreds of men and boys held captive in a soccer stadium. Akashi later insisted that he had no advance intelligence of the planned attack, but he had many warnings. The Bosnian government had urgently and repeatedly provided him with accurate information about what was happening, including the forced departure of thousands of Bosnian males from their homes and villages. Later investigations confirmed that UN and U.S. intelligence had detected signs of an upcoming Serb offensive, but not of Serb intentions to annihilate thousands of Bosnian males. The Bosnian government, better informed, had intercepted Serb radio communications describing plans for mass murder, but no one else was taking these reports seriously. That the killings were planned in advance has since been confirmed by the testimony of Bosnian Serb officers at The Hague. 120. UN officials said they did not regard Bosnian government intelligence as reliable, although they later acknowledged that Bosnian officials had accurately reported the systematic slaughter of Bosnian men and boys. UN and U.S. government officials later acknowledged that they had too little confidence in information from the Bosnian government. A year later, Newsday's Roy Gutman compiled the 121 following timeline of events: June 4, June 7, June 9, June 13, June 17, July 6. French General Bernard Janvier, Supreme UN military commander for former Yugoslavia, meets with Bosnian Serb General Ratko Mladic to discuss the release of UN hostages and an end to NATO airstrikes. Serbs release 111 peacekeeper hostages. Special Representative Asashi Akashi announces that the UN will abide by strictly peacekeeping principles, that is, no use of force. Serbs release 118 more hostages. Serbs release the remaining UN hostages. Serbs attack Srebrenica. July 11, July 12-18, August 8, August 10, Serbs capture Srebrenica. They drive men and boys out of the town, then slaughter them. Serbs kill approximately 7,000 to 9,000 men and boys from Srebrenica in cold blood. Newsday reveals the massacres. U.S. Ambassador Madeleine Albright shares CIA photographs with UN colleagues as proof of the mass executions. 122. The Dutch UNPROFOR contingent that was supposed to be protecting the refugees was very lightly armed. The Serbian forces, on the other hand, were ready for war with tanks, armored vehicles, heavy artillery, communications, and intelligence. For months, the Bosnian Serbs had blocked all deliveries of food, fuel, and spare parts to the Dutch troops. These conditions led the Dutch Bet Force commander to conclude, "My battalion is no longer willing, able, or in the position to consider itself impartial due to the policy of the Bosnian Serb government and the BS of Bosnian Serb army." The commander spoke repeatedly with General Mladic, appealing for help. Meanwhile, progressively more desperate refugees were gathering in Srebrenica. 4,000 were already there, and their numbers were swelling rapidly. In a letter, Boris Yeltsin placed blame firmly on the aggressors. "This long-lasting and severe situation is no longer acceptable for the soldiers. Therefore, it is my strongest opinion that this Bosnian Serb government should be blamed for it in the full extent as well as for the consequences in the future." Apparently, no one received Yeltsin's message until much later. 123. French General Bernard Janvier, Supreme UN military commander for former Yugoslavia, opposed the use of NATO air power even before he negotiated the release of UN forces held hostage by the Serbs. By most accounts, it was Janvier who struck the deal with Serb commander Ratko Mladic that NATO would halt air attacks and the Serbs would release the hostages. As U.S. Ambassador to Bosnia John Menzies later confirmed, they agreed over the opposition of the United Kingdom's General Rupert Smith, who favored using more force to try to save the Bosnians. General Smith argued that analysis of Serb behavior indicated that their intention is to finish the war this year and take every risk to achieve it. They will destroy the eastern enclaves this year. Javier believed that the Serbs' desire for international recognition would prevent them from going to such extremes. According to the Newsday accounts, Javier told UN headquarters that Bosnia's forces were adequate to defend Srebrenica, which they were not, and that NATO air power was not needed, which it was. Akashi, always opposed to the use of force, informed the Serbs that UNPROFOR would strictly observe peacekeeping principles, that is, refraining from the use of force. Another divergent account of the deal asserted that it was an agreement not between UNPROFOR forces and Bosnian Serbs, but between UN officials. Bosnian Serbs Richard Holbrooke commented, "To this day, Washington has never been sure of what was actually agreed to, but after the hostages were released, the intensity of Bosnian Serb military effort increased dramatically, with no further UN or NATO airstrikes." 124. After the release of the UN hostages, word circulated of a secret deal between Javier and Mladic, under which UNPROFOR commanders agreed never to ask for NATO air power again in Bosnia. This agreement was publicly affirmed by Milosevic and the Bosnian Serbs, but denied by French and UN officials. In fact, however, no further NATO airstrikes were carried out. Bout Rosgali removed from General Smith the authority to call for NATO airstrikes, saying that he would personally make all further decisions. From New York. 125. There were no further calls for airstrikes. The Washington Post later ran a story stating that 12,000 Bosnian men had set out on foot from Srebrenica at dawn on July 11 in an attempt to escape death at the hands of the Serbs. Fewer than half survived the march. The article described 5 or 6 massacre sites at which large numbers of Bosnian men and boys were forced to dig trenches. They were then shot and buried. One Bosnian man who had observed the process from a hiding place said that the slaughter and burial were systematic and utterly brutal, and that General Mladic was personally in charge of the entire operation. This eyewitness said that the Dutch peacekeepers made little attempt to defend the civilian population. They were worried about their own hostages. The account continued. Refugees later described how many of the peacekeepers were forced at gunpoint to strip to their underwear by Bosnian Serb soldiers, who then strutted around in UN uniforms themselves. 126. A very few men and boys managed to survive by pretending to be dead, hiding among the corpses. No precise number of those killed is available. The common estimate is approximately 9,000. Later investigations by a French parliamentary committee and by the Dutch government confirmed that the men and boys of Srebrenica were murdered in cold blood over a period of several days. They were undefended, with no assistance from the UNPROFOR peacekeepers, who seemed less interested in protecting Bosnians in a UN safe haven than maintaining satisfactory relations with the Serbs and protecting their own security. The Serb capture and mistreatment of UN peacekeepers and the slaughter of the undefended male population of Srebrenica in July 1995 were deeply humiliating for UN forces. It was the most shocking mass murder in Europe since World War II, and the widespread international revulsion that followed finally mobilized NATO troops to action. French President Jacques Chirac, who had approached the British and been turned down, called President Bill Clinton to propose jointly planned responses in the future. The two agreed to abandon the UN's proportionate response and dual key strategies if the Bosnian Serbs continued to attack Muslim towns. Henceforth, NATO would be authorized to launch airstrikes on the request of the UNPROFOR force commander without seeking approval from the UN Secretary-General. NATO carried out 3,400 sorties against the Bosnian Serbs in less than 2 weeks. The strain on U.S.-European relations. The Bosnian conflict challenged the Euro-American relationship because Americans were generally more ready than Europeans to use force to defend the Bosnians. More Americans than Europeans saw Bosnia as the victim of Serbian aggression, ethnic cleansing, and conquest, and wanted to help, although they did not want their country to become involved in a ground war. Many Americans disapproved of the UN's posture of neutrality between aggressors and victims, and did not believe it was morally permissible for a UN member state to be denied the right of self-defense through an arms embargo. The disagreements primarily concerned the arms embargo, the use of air power, and the right of peacekeepers to fend off Serb assaults. American impatience grew with the UN's inefficient policies, cumbersome chains of command and control, and unrealistic rules of engagement. Tension over the lack of response to continued Serbian aggression had been building, with Americans in and out of government calling for more vigorous implementation of the Security Council resolutions and more determined use of force to punish and deter armed attacks. A bipartisan coalition in Congress called for lifting the arms embargo to permit Bosnia to defend itself. But Secretary-General Boutros Ghali had established his control over NATO airstrikes, and he used the control to block the use of airstrikes against the Serbs. In an effort to impose a settlement, the contact group issued an ultimatum. If either side did not accept the latest proposed plan, disincentives including military force would be used. This was a take-it-or-leave-it approach. General Michael Rose called Admiral Leon Smith in Naples and asked him to put NATO aircraft overhead, which Smith did within 5 minutes. 127 Akashi denied having turned down a NATO request for permission for an airstrike, saying that NATO will take the lead on this, because the violation of the no-fly zone and the direct attack on its planes are direct challenges to the alliance. But permission to use air power was never granted. Of the growing differences between the Americans and the Europeans, Ambrose Evans Pritchard wrote in the London Daily Telegraph, something has finally snapped. The relations between the United States and Britain. The irritation that has been festering over Balkan policy for 3 years has reached the point of irreparable rift. 128 NATO was finished, Pritchard opined, and with it the intimate British-American relationship that had existed since World War II. There was no enforcement of Security Council resolutions, no enforcement of no-fly zones or of safe havens, little delivery of humanitarian assistance, no deterrence of attacks, no protection for peacekeepers or refugees, and no enforcement of NATO ultimatums. Each deadline set by NATO and UNPROFOR was missed, each safe haven violated, each effort to alter the UN mode of operation rebuffed, and each decision to alter it ignored. Humiliation of UN forces was tolerated and thus intensified, and attacks on civilians spread. NATO was permitted to attack only a runway and 3 missile sites. This extremely weak response was defended as necessary to protect UN peacekeeping force. To U.S. complaints, French, British, and UN officials essentially replied that the United States had no standing because it refused to contribute troops to UNPROFOR. In the fall of 1995, the Clinton administration reluctantly announced that it would no longer enforce the arms embargo. At that point, an open rift developed between the United States and the British and French, who critiqued the American withdrawal as unhelpful and inappropriate behavior for a country that had no forces on the ground. The WEU pledged to maintain the arms embargo, and Willie Cleese announced that NATO would continue to enforce the embargo because it had been mandated by the UN. Tensions multiplied after the Security Council authorized NATO to attack Serb targets in Croatia. UN officials debated and delayed and finally permitted 50 NATO planes to attack 3 Serb missile sites in Croatia in a pinprick effort to slow Serb aggression against BiH. Things got worse after NATO failed to endorse a U.S. plan to save BiH. 2 days later, NATO joined UN officials in announcing that nothing would be done to mitigate the Serb assault on BiH. The move to Dayton. The war had taken a hideous toll on the people of Bosnia. By the end of 1994, at least 200,000 people had died and roughly half of Bosnia's 4.25 million inhabitants had been driven from their homes. 129 possessions had been seized and destroyed, property confiscated, and all deeds and records that established ownership burned. Many males between the ages of 16 and 60 had been killed. The devastation virtually guaranteed that for many there would be no home to return to, yet many still longed to return home. The changed balance of power on the ground gave Milosevic an interest in negotiating to end the fighting. Serb supremacy in the war had rested on military strength. The Yugoslav National Army JNA had been one of the strongest and best equipped on the European continent. It was not exclusively Serb, but when Yugoslavia split into pieces, the largest part of the army remained with Serbia. At the beginning of the war, Croatia and Bosnia lacked the men and arms to defend themselves, and the 1991 UN arms embargo had made it nearly impossible for them to acquire arms and military training. But Croatia had money and connections, and once the Croatians found ways to buy weapons and hire military advisors, they were able to defend themselves and help Bosnia gain access to arms. It was because of this that the Serb monopoly in power was ended. Meanwhile, the United States, France, and NATO began to use their overwhelming advantage in air power and tightened the economic sanctions against Serbia. Milosevic had important incentives to end the war. The split between Milosevic and his Bosnian Serb allies, Karadzic and Mladic, had become public. Milosevic wrested from them an agreement that he alone would represent all Serbs in the negotiations. Holbrooke had categorically refused to meet with Karadzic and Mladic, who had been indicted as war criminals by the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in July 1995. Preliminary negotiations included a reluctant agreement from the Bosnian Serbs that Bosnia-Herzegovina would consist of 2 entities. 51% of the territory would go to the Muslim Croat Federation and 49% to the Bosnian Serbs. Russian President Boris Yeltsin helped by writing a letter to the Serb leadership guaranteeing that he would send Russian troops into areas from which the Serbs withdrew so they could not be quickly occupied by Muslim forces. NATO officials helped with assurances that the NATO commanders would control the use of weapons around Sarajevo. Bosnia-Herzegovina would have a collective, rotating presidency. The Bosnian representative, Alija Begovic, would take the first 8-month term, followed by the Serb Momcilo Krajisnik and then the Croat Krasimir Zubak. The Serbs wanted to divide Sarajevo, but the Muslims refused to discuss it. The Americans pressured the Croats and Muslims to accept a ceasefire and create a viable Muslim-Croat federation. Finally, the three parties agreed to the basic provisions for the creation of Bosnia-Herzegovina and also maintained the October 5, 1995 ceasefire. The Bosnian president, Izetbegovic, clung tenaciously to the right of Muslim refugees to return to their homes, thus securing their hold on eastern Bosnia. For a time, the conflict between the Muslims and the Croats became almost as bitter and as murderous as the earlier conflict between Muslims and Serbs. Then the Muslim foreign minister, Haris Salajic, announced that he wanted Goraz, the last Muslim-safe area in eastern Bosnia. Twice the negotiations deadlocked and twice Milosevic compromised, enabling an agreement to be reached, the Dayton Peace Accords. Finally, on November 1, 1995, the United States and other contact group members France, Germany, Russia, and the United Kingdom brought the warring factions together for formal peace talks at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. The three strong-willed, difficult presidents, the Croat Franjo Tudjman, the Serb Slobodan Milosevic, and the Bosnian Muslim Alija Izetbegovic ultimately accepted that the talks would take place under rules set by the Americans and that Ambassador Holbrooke would lead the contact group assisted by General Wesley Clark. Clinton's Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, welcomed the three presidents to Dayton. The negotiations would take place under his skillful guidance, drawing on Holbrooke's tactical skills, knowledge of the area's politics, and understanding of Milosevic. The U.S. goal at Dayton was to turn the 60-day ceasefire into a permanent peace. The Dayton Peace Accords ended the war and established Bosnia-Herzegovina as an internationally recognized sovereign state. In the discussion of ending the war in Bosnia, the French insisted on a new constitution, recreation of normal conditions of life, and a secure environment. The French also indicated their intention to introduce civilian authority into every level of the military command system, emphasizing that civilian authorities would report not to the military commander in NATO, but to the EU and the UN. Finally, the issues were settled. The Dayton Peace Accords provided both more and less than the participants expected. The agreement, initialed on November 21, 1995, did not solve all the problems, but it resolved enough of them to provide a pause and for all parties to feel they had achieved minimum goals. In addition to a ceasefire and agreement on arms reductions and boundaries, the accords created a new state that included two multi-ethnic entities, established boundaries between them, and committed the parties to reversing ethnic cleansing, arresting war criminals, and helping refugees return to their homes. The agreement provided a basis for building democratic, multi-ethnic institutions for Southeastern Europe, with closer ties to the rest of Europe. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe (OSCE) would supervise elections, and Carl Bildt, the Swedish Prime Minister and UN Special Envoy for the Balkans, would oversee implementation of the political provisions of the accord. The accords embodied the parties' understanding that force was a necessary component of implementing an agreement in the Balkans, allocating power among two entities and three ethnic groups. The three national groups that had been at war for years would survive. Each group would keep its army. By this time, all three armies had weapons, although the Muslims lacked heavy weapons. The agreement would be overseen and enforced by a 60,000-person NATO-led implementation force IFOR, to which the United States contributed 20,000 troops. IFOR would be headed by an American, Admiral Leighton Smith, who made clear the new rules of engagement. The senior soldier in the scene has the right and responsibility to protect himself and those under his command or leadership. If he feels threatened, he will use whatever force is necessary to neutralize that threat. 130. A NATO-led stabilization force SFOR, 30,000 strong, would also be deployed throughout the country to assist in the continuing implementation of the accords and to protect the unified state. S4 would be overwhelmingly made up of NATO troops, but would also include Russians, Ukrainians, Moroccans, and other Eastern Europeans. It was estimated that about 2,000 mujahideen from Iran, Afghanistan, and other Muslim states were in Bosnia. The rapid departure of these foreign Islamic fighters was specifically agreed to in the accords. The accords were signed on December 14, 1995, in Paris. The official transfer of authority in Bosnia from the UN peacekeeper mission to the NATO peace enforcement operation was scheduled for December 19. Meanwhile, the U.S.-Bosnia negotiating team worked to resolve the last details. Holbrooke believed that four key issues still needed to be addressed for the implementation of the accords. The corruption must be eliminated, transparency and accountability must be established. War criminals must be arrested, refugees must be allowed to return to their homes, and the pace of return must be quickened. Srebrenica must be repopulated. The perpetrators of the Srebrenican massacre must be jailed. Freedom of the press must be established. Additional, unwritten commitments related to the Dayton Accords rested on each party's sometimes unspoken understanding of the stakes. These commitments included the U.S. promise that the UN arms embargo would be lifted promptly and that the United States would assume responsibility for arming and training Bosnian forces to enable them to achieve parity with the Serb forces operating in Bosnia. And the entire agreement was reinforced by the unwritten commitment that NATO would respond to Serb aggression with overwhelming, not proportionate force. 131. Throughout the negotiations, Richard Holbrooke provided brilliant leadership on the American side. When his principal assistant, Robert Fraser, and two colleagues were killed in an accident on the treacherous mountain road leading to Sarajevo, Holbrooke, devastated but determined, took charge of the negotiations. However, many provisions of the accords have not been carried out and several problems remain unresolved. The capture of war criminals, the status of Kosovo, and respect for the rights of Kosovars. This phase of war in the Balkans had ended, but no one was greatly surprised when it resumed 3 years later in Kosovo. The verdict on Srebrenica. War crimes trials in The Hague have provided details about the mass murder at Srebrenica, making it clear that it was a well-planned, deliberate killing operation. In November 3, two senior Bosnian Serb officers gave the War Crimes Tribunal detailed accounts of the orders they received from General Mladic for the murder and burial of more than 132,000 unarmed Bosnian boys and men. A French parliamentary commission, established at the urging of the humanitarian organization Médecins Sans Frontières Doctors Without Borders to investigate the French role at Srebrenica, published its report in November. 29, 2001, the responsibility for the disaster, it concluded, was shared by France and its Western allies for failing to prevent the massacre after the fall of the Muslim enclave of eastern Bosnia in July 1995. The report concluded that the tragedy was ultimately caused by the absence of political will in France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and among the Bosnians themselves won a list that should also include a failure of political will by the United Nations. 133. 4 of the 10 deputies on the commission did not agree with all the conclusions, especially the conclusion that France had made a deal with Ratko Mladic to secure the release of UNPROFOR troops. General Javier testified about the disagreements among himself, Akashi, and General Rupert Smith. All witnesses saw General Mladic as the person responsible for the Srebrenica massacres, and many witnesses also held him personally responsible for the siege and the repeated attacks on the unprotected citizens of Sarajevo. 134. Tadeusz Mazowicki, who served as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights for Yugoslavia from August 1992 through July 1995, resigned after the fall of Srebrenica and Zepa in August 1995 in protest against the UN's hypocritical claim to be defending Bosnia when in fact it had abandoned it. The Geneva-based UN Human Rights Commission expressed support for Mazowicki's moral and courageous stand and his resignation in protest of the perpetuation of gross violations in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Secretary General Boutros Ghali had no comment. Mazowicki was finishing his 18th report on human rights violations in former Yugoslavia when he learned of the massacres. The establishment of safe zones where civilians would be protected by UN peacekeepers had been his idea. In fact, his first recommendation. He had asked for sufficient troops to protect the safe areas. The UN Secretariat had requested 34,000 troops to defend the safe areas, but the Security Council had supplied only 7,600 for the mission. 135. Speaking of protecting human rights is meaningless in the context of the lack of consistency and courage on the part of the international community and its leaders, Mazowicki wrote. He never hesitated to accuse all sides of the conflict of criminal acts, but he concluded that the Bosnian Serbs were guilty of perhaps 80% of the human rights violations and war crimes. He saw the fall of Zepa and Srebrenica as a critical moment that called into question the whole international order, much like the failure of the League of Nations to confront Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia, from which the League never recovered. NATO's very credibility, Mazowicki believed, was now at stake. Boutros Ghali, meanwhile, chose this moment of defeat and humiliation to pay a visit to Africa. Why, asked Michael Ignatieff in an interview for The New Yorker, why not return to Bosnia? Because if I do, said the Secretary General, all the African countries will tell the world that while there is genocide in Africa, 1 million people have died in Rwanda. The Secretary General pays attention only to a village in Europe. 136. But Srebrenica was no village, and this was not the first time Boutros Ghali had made clear his view that Africa's problem should have priority over Europe's. In July 1992, Boutros Ghali had advised the Security Council to ignore Lord Peter Carrington's efforts to end the fighting in the Balkans and focus instead on Somalia. In September 1992, he opposed enforcement of the no-fly zone. In the spring of 1993, he reiterated the extraordinary notion that UN peacekeepers should remain neutral in a conflict in which civilians were being starved and shelled. In April 1993, he requested the recall of the French General Philippe Morlin, who with great personal courage had led a UN convoy of food and medicines into Srebrenica, where civilians even then were starving. And in the fall of 1994, Boutros Ghali requested the recall of the second French general, Jean Cot, the commander of UN forces for former Yugoslavia, who had offended the Secretary General by pressing too hard for prompt and effective air cover for his forces. In his interview with Ignatieff, Boutros Ghali commented that humanitarian efforts often fail. He recalled other instances of failure and genocide. Everywhere we work, we are struggling against the culture of death, he said. 137, but he did not struggle hard enough. Instead, he claimed control over the use of force by the UN and then deprived victims of help in their struggle against aggression, redefined peacekeeping so that it was of no use to anyone, wrote rules of engagement that did not permit UN forces to protect civilians under their care, and shackled NATO, the old Europe and the new. In the complicated diplomacy that finally silenced the guns of Sarajevo and produced the Dayton Peace Accords and the new state of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the outlines of a new Europe could be discerned. It was not the Europe of the Cold War, though NATO played a role. It was not the Europe of Brussels, though the European Union representative, David Owen, continued his negotiations. It was the historic Europe of nation-states, Europe des patries. Charles de Gaulle had called it, that stretched from the Atlantic to the Urals. Lenin was no help in understanding the politics of historic Europe. With his innate contempt for nation-states, he would never have understood why, for example, Boris Yeltsin moved 400 troops to Sarajevo, where the Serbs greeted them as saviors. More relevant than Lenin is the history of the Ottoman Empire, whose 14th century conquest of Serbia still moves Russians to sympathy, Greeks to rage, and Serbs to mobilization. During the Cold War, ideology and bloc politics had replaced ethnicity and history as organizing principles of European politics. With the end of the Cold War, ideology gave way again to ethnicity and history. Many observers believed the old Europe was dead, a casualty of the two world wars, Bolshevism, Nazism, fascism, and the European Union. But as Yugoslavia disintegrated, old patterns of trust and mistrust, affinity and hostility reemerged, and European powers reached across centuries to find natural allies from earlier times: Serbs and Russians, Germans and Croats, Bosnians and Bulgarians. Nowhere were the old patterns more clear than in Russia, where fanatics like Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, threatened Russian airstrikes if NATO attacked Serbs, and liberals like former Economics Minister Yegor Gaidar and the political class recalled the old Slavic ties that linked Russia and Serbia. Radio Moscow reminded listeners that it was a Russian tradition to support the Serbs, those ethnic Slav people who are Orthodox Christians. This sentimental recollection of historic Russo-Serbian Orthodox solidarity not only reinforced the Slavic brotherhood, it reminded Russia that it should have a voice and a role in any Balkan settlement. And so, rather suddenly after the ceasefire was signed, Yeltsin moved Russian troops from Croatia to Sarajevo and threatened a veto in the UN Security Council. Suddenly, Russia was back as superpower, playing an independent role in the first European crisis since the end of the Cold War, imposing compliance of a sort in the Serbs around Sarajevo and forestalling the NATO airstrikes. Russia was not the only country that was profoundly affected by the Balkan crisis. It stimulated Germany to make its first wholly independent foreign policy initiative since World War II. When it backed Croatia with diplomatic recognition and economic help, Germany's EU colleagues were shocked and offended by its unexpected interest in traditional national goals. And Germany's concern with Croatia aroused anxiety in France, where politicians began to worry that if Germany's attention turned east rather than west, it might drift away from the many ties and institutions designed to anchor it in democratic Western Europe. So France, confronted with the ghost of the old Europe, worked harder to strengthen its national and multilateral diplomacy. As the Balkan crisis deepened, Socialist President François Mitterrand and his neo-Gaullist Prime Minister Edouard Balladur worked to extend France's alliances and influence in the East as well as in Anatole and Brussels. De Gaulle had seen a Franco-Russian entente as the natural protection for France against a resurgent German nationalism and Serbia as the southern anchor of a Paris-Moscow arrangement. How did the Americans fit into the new European politics where alliances were based less on shared values than on shared history? The American legal moral tradition in foreign affairs was very different from the historical European balance of power tradition. This was one reason that the Clinton administration had a difficult time finding common ground on Bosnia and Kosovo with European allies, an equally difficult time explaining its actions and intentions to the American people and perhaps to itself as the situation developed. The savage war against Bosnia illuminated some important differences in the political sensibilities and reflexes of the old continent and the United States and foreshadowed changes in that relationship that are still emerging. 5. Kosovo. The events in Kosovo, especially in 1998-99, offered further proof of the dangers of wishful thinking and the underestimation of bad actors, in this case the same bad actor who had been at work in Bosnia. Once again, UN threats were unpersuasive. Once again, Anatole was divided. In this case, however, the United States was able to coordinate action with Anatole and bring the ethnic cleansing to an end, perhaps the Clinton administration's only real foreign policy victory, although it was a long time coming. And the UN has proved useful after the fact in peacekeeping and conflict resolution. Background of the crisis. Soon after the death of Josip Tito on May 4, 1980, rumors spread among the Serbian population of Yugoslavia that Albanians in the southern province of Kosovo were engaged in a plot to eliminate Serbs from the area and even that they were planning genocide. On September 24, 1986, a memorandum from the Serbian Academy of Sciences was published in the mass circulation paper Vrsnja Novosti, bitterly attacking Tito's 1974 constitution. That constitution had made Kosovo and Vojvodina autonomous provinces with seats in the federal presidency, had given them a voice and vote equal to those of Yugoslavia's 6 republics, and had established autonomy in most areas. The destruction of this constitution became a principal goal of Serb nationalists, and Slobodan Milosevic was their chief spokesman. By the time U.S. Ambassador Warren Zimmerman arrived in Belgrade in March 1989, Slobodan Milosevic had already made his reputation as an ambitious and ruthless, in Zimmerman's words, nationalist leader. One who used communist organizational tactics to launch his campaign of repression in Kosovo and extend his personal power in Serbia and Yugoslavia. Wielding populist rhetoric, Soviet-style ruthlessness, and the Communist Party network, Milosevic packed meetings and purged opponents in his campaign to create a new post-communist Yugoslavia. He did not hesitate to use force to make life increasingly difficult for the Kosovars. Milosevic's intentions were already evident in 1989. Soon after being elected president in Serbia, he revoked the Statute of Autonomy for Kosovo. That revocation was the prelude to a campaign of discrimination and ethnic cleansing against Albanian Muslims who constituted 90% of Kosovo's population, a campaign that ultimately drove Yugoslavia to war and the Anatole government's countermeasures. It was hard for Americans to comprehend how aggressive and persistent Milosevic was in the 8 years following Tito's death, just as it has always seemed difficult for us to grasp the scope and ambitions of any coercive ideology or personality throughout history. Milosevic pressed Serbia's claim to sovereignty over Yugoslavia and Kosovo and managed to persuade many Europeans and Americans of its justice, even though Serbia had no historic or constitutional right to such sovereignty. He was the leader who drove Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina into wars that left millions homeless and tens of thousands dead. The man whose megalomaniacal drive for power reduced the Yugoslav federal state to a fraction of its former size. Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina eventually acquired weapons and won their independence, but not until Croatia and Bosnia had endured brutal ethnic cleansing and war had spread to Kosovo. From the beginning, Milosevic ruled by force and responded only to force, rebuffing the efforts of seasoned diplomats like Cyrus Vance and the United Kingdom's Peter Carrington and David Owen to find peaceful settlements to the conflicts. Milosevic was not interested in agreements that gave minorities equal rights or any rights. He was not interested in negotiating agreements or implementing agreements that had been negotiated. Peace and stability were not his priorities. As chairman of the then Central Committee of the League of Communists of the Serb Party, Milosevic launched his plan to gain control of the federal presidency and parliament in early 1989 through a series of carefully drafted constitutional amendments imposed arbitrarily by fiat that progressively restricted and ultimately eliminated Kosovo's autonomy. The amendments deprived Kosovo and Vojvodina of autonomy and gave Milosevic a near majority in the federal presidency. Milosevic was determined to undermine Kosovar Albanians' political, economic, and social rights, and he used these amendments to seize control over Kosovo's police, courts, and civil defense, its social, economic, educational, and administrative policy, and even over the choice of an official language. He eliminated Albanian language instruction, segregated Albanian schools, and abolished the Academy of Sciences in Kosovo. Ethnic Albanians were fired from state jobs and replaced by Serbs. The names of streets were changed from Albanian to Serbian. The Albanian majority sought to defend its rights under the 1974 constitution, launching demonstrations against Milosevic's amendments. He responded by declaring a state of emergency, enforcing it with large numbers of Serbian security police. In March 1990, Milosevic spearheaded a program designed to increase the power of Serbs in Kosovo at the expense of Albanians by manipulating property rights and sales, helping Serbs acquire houses and work in Kosovo, encouraging a low birth rate among Albanians, and replacing Albanians with Serbs in desirable jobs, including civil service, education, and the prof. On July 2, 1990, Albanian members of the Kosovo parliament passed a resolution affirming that Kosovo was an equal and independent entity within the framework of the Yugoslav Federation. This was simply a restatement of its status under the 1974 constitution, but Serb authorities reacted by dissolving the assembly. 2 months later, the Kosovar delegates declared Kosovo a republic and held elections in a referendum that pronounced overwhelmingly in favor of independence. Out of these Activities emerged the Democratic League of Kosovo (LDK), with Ibrahim Rugova, a pacifist and Sorbonne-educated professor of literature and history, as its leader. Yet the LDK was unable to stem the tide of nationalism Milosevic had inspired. The attraction of violent nationalism in some regions of southeastern Europe illustrates the danger Milosevic and ethnic extremism pose to the peace of the region and the danger of violent ideologies to stability throughout regions of the world. It was not dominoes we needed to be concerned about in the Balkans, it was the contagion of mass murder. The only known antidote to such a crisis is the imposition of law and civilization by direct intervention. That was why, in 1999, Anatio finally went to war, the 1990s evolution of the crisis. By the time he was elected president of Serbia in January 1990, Milosevic had made his priorities clear. He was a Serb nationalist, not a Yugoslav nationalist, and he was determined to make Serbia whole and to strip Kosovo and Vojvodina of their autonomy, their votes in the federal presidency, their rights under the federal constitution, their officials, and their constitutions. By abolishing the autonomy of these provinces and taking their votes, Serbia would directly control 3 of the 8 votes in the federal presidency. With Montenegro, whose support he could count on, Milosevic would control 4 votes, clearing his way to pursue his campaign against the Albanians without political opposition. Milosevic was able to pursue his designs in Kosovo throughout the early 1990s largely unchallenged, in large part because of the international community's hands-off attitude toward the region. In 1991, the Council of Ministers of the European Community appointed France's former Minister of Justice Robert Badner to the Arbitration Commission of the Peace Conference on the former Yugoslavia. When the newly renamed Badner Arbitration Commission took on the subject of violence and legal challenges in Yugoslavia and its republics, it concluded that the international community should recognize Yugoslavia and its republics but ignore the autonomous regions. The status of Kosovo and anything that occurred within its borders, such as human rights violations, were considered to be internal issues, too. The Commission's position was not unique, rather, it was the traditional position held for years and echoed at the Munich and London conferences on Yugoslavia. At both conferences, concern was expressed about the bleak situation in Kosovo, and the Serbian leadership was urged to respect minority rights and refrain from further repression in Kosovo III, but that was as far as it went. The only other mention of Kosovo during the time in international forums was during the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe OSCE Helsinki Summit in July 1992, when the Declaration on the Yugoslav Crisis urged the authorities in Belgrade to refrain from further repression of Kosovar Albanians. Once again, however, the issue was treated as an internal Yugoslav matter. And once again, words did not dissuade Milosevic's plans. The United States took a distinctly different position. In December 1992, in the so-called Christmas warning, President George H.W. Bush declared, in the event of conflict in Kosovo caused by Serbian action, the United States will be prepared to employ military force against the Serbians in Kosovo and in Serbia proper. He was making the point that escalation of violence in Kosovo would be viewed as more than an internal problem. 5. This warning was restated at a news conference in February 1993 by the incoming Clinton administration's newly appointed Secretary of State Warren Christopher, who reiterated Bush's position: we remain prepared to respond against the Serbs in the event of a conflict in Kosovo caused by Serbian action. 6. But the strong words of the new administration were not followed by strong actions. Instead, the worsening Bosnian crisis monopolized American and European top officials' attention, claimed their resources and energy. In the interest of halting the widely publicized mass murders in Bosnia, the Western leaders dropped Kosovo from their immediate agenda. Anxious to treat Milosevic as a peace broker, they withheld criticism of his treatment of Kosovo, giving the impression that Anatio and the contact group had no interest in the troubled region. Meanwhile, by the mid-1990s, Milosevic's treatment of Kosovar Albanians had degenerated into widespread state-sponsored violence. In 1994, the Council for the Defense of Human Rights and Freedoms in Kosovo recorded 2,157 physical assaults by police, 3,553 raids on private dwellings, and 963 arbitrary arrests. Milosevic was preoccupied with the so-called Serbian question in Yugoslavia, his name for the decline of the Serbian population in the province of Kosovo. His campaign of terror drove thousands of Kosovar Albanians to flee to Italy between November 1994 and mid-January 1995 alone. 9. After unleashing war in Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia, and imposing unspeakable misery on the people of these republics, Milosevic agreed to the 1995 Dayton Peace Accords under heavy American and European pressure. He partially implemented them, only because they were backed by substantial force. But the negotiations at Dayton neglected to deal with Kosovo. The Western powers never made it an issue, and Milosevic was hardly likely to allow democratic self-government for the region or honor the human rights of the Kosovar Albanians on his own recognizance. And so, in the late 1990s, he escalated his campaign of violence and ethnic cleansing. The Serbian government justified its aggression against ethnic Albanians by insisting that its actions were a reaction to increasing violence against the Serbs, but until 1995, Kosovar Albanians had offered only nonviolent resistance to the government in Belgrade. Even after the outbreak of violence in 1998, most Kosovars followed their pacifist leader, the poet and intellectual Ibrahim Rugova. 10. Rugova believed that the only way to restore autonomy for Kosovo was through diplomatic pressure from the West. However, as Serb aggression increased, support for the Kosovo Liberation Army KLA also increased. The first violent incidents took place in October 1997, when Serb police assaulted a peaceful protest of 2,000 students in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. Later that year, the KLA mounted what the Belgrade news agency Beta called a series of terrorist actions, attacking a group of Serbian police. 11. In fact, the KLA was a small group of poorly armed and poorly organized rebels. Not until the summer of 1998 did the KLA grow into a force of about 1,000 soldiers, capable of resisting Serb security forces and large enough to gain international attention. 12. By 1998, less than 3 years after the signing of the Dayton Accords, the refugee crisis in Kosovo had grown so extreme that it threatened to destabilize neighboring countries. The crisis, which lasted from March 1998 through March 1999, was the culmination of Milosevic's decade of oppression. Reports of appalling violence came regularly from the region. On March 5, 1998, Serb forces brutally killed Kosovo Liberation Army KLA regional commander Adem Jeshori, who had dared to stand up to Serb aggression along with more than 50 members of his family. Confronted with such atrocities, the Western powers wrestled over the appropriate response. Americans favored a strong response to Serb aggression, but the Europeans resisted military action, raising the same tired arguments that had been made against the use of force in Bosnia. The result of the lack of any serious international interest in Kosovo, coupled with the increased Serb abuses of ethnic Albanians, undermined Rugova's peaceful resistance attempts and stimulated greater violence by the KL as they fought off the Serbs. By the spring of 1998, the KL had begun guerrilla warfare against the Serb security forces, garnering attention. Responding to pressure from the contact group, the Council of Europe held debates on the situation in Kosovo. In January 1998, Council of Europe Resolution 1146 expressed concern about the deterioration of the political situation in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and the serious implications for the stability of the Balkan region. The Council condemned the continued repression of the ethnic Albanian population in Kosovo. 13. As in 1992, this expression of concern from Europe or from any nation did not prevent or deter Milosevic from continuing his military campaign against the ethnic Albanian population. Having lost Bosnia, he merely redirected his focus of nationalist passions on Kosovo, which became central to his hold on power. Government propaganda, a favorite Milosevic tool, and the Serb media inflamed the situation, and the Serb security forces took ever more violent action. In February 1998, Yugoslav forces claiming to rid Kosovo of terrorists attacked the Drenica region using helicopters and armored vehicles. According to Amnesty International, however, between 28 February and 1 March, the Serbian police killed 26 ethnic Albanians in the villages of Likišane and Sires. There was evidence that many of these were unlawfully killed. 14. A subsequent Amnesty International report indicated that the deteriorating security situation in Drenica had led to hundreds of civilian deaths, many apparently a result of deliberate or indiscriminate attacks, and that the attacks on civilians have been part of the reason why more than 50,000 people have fled their homes. These attacks further inflamed an already volatile situation. 15. Although targeting civilians had long been a policy of the Milosevic government, the brutality of the massacre at Drenica upped the level of violence and captured the attention of foreign policy officials in the U.S. government and elsewhere. At a meeting in Rome with Italian Foreign Minister Lamberto Dini on March 7, 1998, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright addressed the explosive and worrisome situation in Kosovo. 16. She had dealt with Milosevic before. After 5 years of work on Bosnia as the U.S. ambassador to the UN, she believed that his actions were moral outrages and feared that Milosevic could seriously destabilize the region. Moreover, her personal experience of escaping Nazi-occupied Europe left her ideologically opposed to appeasing dictators, for she had direct experience of the deadly consequences when ambitious leaders resort to coercion and violence to achieve their goals unchecked. She knew that Milosevic understood only decisive action, and she remained committed to her word that the United States was not going to stand by and watch the Serbian authorities do in Kosovo what they can no longer get away with doing in Bosnia. 17. Albright was determined to take serious measures to punish the Belgrade government, but the division among the Allies persisted after years of war in the Balkans, and they had only deepened despite the Dayton Peace Accord. One who shared many of Albright's views was General Wesley Clark, who had been NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe SSCUR since 1997. Clark's appointment was controversial within the military. His views were more hawkish than those of many in the Pentagon, including Clinton's second-term Secretary of Defense William Cohen and the service chiefs who were reluctant to engage militarily in Kosovo. But Clark had experience with Bosnia, having dealt with Milosevic in Bosnia and Croatia and attended the Dayton negotiations. He was aware of Milosevic's penchant for violence. When Clark attended an inspection of U.S. troops stationed in Macedonia in March 1998, Macedonian President Kairo Gilgorov 18 warned him that there would be trouble in Kosovo. Milosevic, he said, likes to use military force. And though he might say he would negotiate, he does this to complicate situations so he can seek advantages for himself. In the end, he respects only the threat of military force. 19. Clark's own experience in Bosnia told him that Gilgorov was right. President Clinton agreed with Secretary Albright that something would have to be done about Kosovo, and he encouraged her personally to take charge of the situation. She later wrote, I concluded that we should not be content to follow the consensus on Kosovo, which was going nowhere. The NSC National Security Council and Pentagon did not desire to become involved in another war in the Balkans. We warned Milosevic repeatedly not to launch a war. On March 19, we met with the president to review our options. Several of us felt that if we did not confront Milosevic now, we would have to confront him later. 20. Clinton agreed, saying, in dealing with aggressors in the Balkans, hesitation is a license to kill. 21. On their own initiative, Albright and Clark met with the contact group on Yugoslavia in London on March 9, 1998.22. The contact group gave Milosevic 10 days to de-escalate conflict, demanding that he agree to political negotiations with ethnic Albanians in Kosovo led by Rugova. The group demanded that he remove the Serb special police from Kosovo and that the Yugoslav government grant full access to the International Committee of the Red Cross and the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights. Albright emphasized the need for action, not rhetoric, as the only effective way to deal with this kind of violence. 23. Diplomatic attempts to check Milosevic. 24. Albright's work through the contact group resulted in a UN resolution on March 31, 1998, imposing an arms embargo on Yugoslavia. Security Council Resolution 1160 stated that failure to make constructive progress toward the peaceful resolution of the situation in Kosovo would lead to the consideration of additional measures by the UN. 25. The resolution did not specify what these measures might be. The very fact of mentioning enforcement, however, signaled that the Security Council no longer considered Kosovo a purely internal Yugoslavian matter. Yugoslavia's ambassador to the UN, Vladislav Jovanovic, denounced the resolution as an unprecedented interference in internal affairs. 26. The Russian and Chinese delegates joined in, stating that interference in a country's internal matters might have wider negative implications. 27. But the denouncements and outrage in New York and the UN resolution had little effect on the situation in Kosovo. Violence pressed forward. Mass Serb forces entered villages and terrorized civilians, killing some, forcing others to leave, separating families, and confiscating 28. Property. Many in the targeted villages were marched to train stations and packed onto trains headed toward the Macedonian border. In response to pressure from Western Europe and the United States, Milosevic held a referendum in April 1998 in which the Serbian people voted against foreigners meddling in their affairs. Empowered by the 95% vote of confidence, he stepped up military operations and ethnic cleansing throughout Kosovo. 29. The United States responded by pushing for new sanctions, but again the Europeans were not willing to take a tough stand against Serbia. Finally, the United States said it was prepared to abandon the contact group if the group balks at imposing new sanctions on the Belgrade government when it meets in Rome. The United Kingdom backed the U.S. position, and in the spring of 1998, 30. Contact Group agreed to freeze Serb and Yugoslav assets and warned that it might block all foreign investment if Milosevic did not agree to mediation into talks with 31 Rugova. A month later, the Contact Group imposed an investment ban on Yugoslavia, and the U.S. government sent Richard Holbrooke to Belgrade for the first round of talks. 32. To show his personal determination to stop the violence, Clinton visited Kosovo, met with Rugova, and pledged U.S. aid. He asked Rugova to continue negotiations with Milosevic and promised that the disaster of Bosnia should not be repeated and will not be repeated. 33. His support and Holbrooke's negotiating skill led to a U.S. brokered meeting between Rugova and Milosevic on May 27, 1998. But despite this achievement, the refugees continued to pour out of Kosovo. By the end of May, an estimated 300 people had been killed since the start of Yugoslav operation in February. In addition, approximately 12,000 refugees had fled into Albania. 34. Milosevic refused to stop the violence, and Rugova broke off the talks. At the Anateo ministerial meeting in Luxembourg on May 28, chaired by British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook, the Balkans dominated the agenda. Clark and the German General Klaus Naumann, the head of Anateo's military committee, reported to the group on the situation. The Germans and the British agreed with the United States that something had to be done about Kosovo. Klaus Kinkel, German foreign minister, said that a clear red line must be drawn. 35. Cook pledged that a modern Europe will not tolerate the full might of an army being used against civilians. 36. In June, after another month of violence, Britain's Center's new Prime Minister, Tony Blair, declared, "The only question that matters is whether you are prepared to use force. And we have to beat 37. Anateo would have to get tough with Milosevic." Among all the Anateo members, however, only the United States, the United Kingdom, and perhaps Germany were prepared to use air power at this point, and only Great Britain was prepared to use ground troops, the ineffective threat of the use of force. In June 1998, columns of Serbian tanks entered Kosovo. They turned Kosovar villages into dust and rubble and killed more than 250 people. 38. Another 5 to 10,000 refugees poured into Albania, causing a humanitarian crisis in that nation. Albanian Premier Fatos Nano warned that the refugee crisis threatened to destabilize the region. 39. In July, the Yugoslav army and Serb police launched a major offensive against the KLA comparable to the ethnic cleansing carried out earlier in Bosnia. More than 2,000 civilians were killed, 200 villages destroyed, and 300,000 civilians displaced. Faced with this new aggression, the Clinton administration began to consider war options. Convinced that putting ground troops into combat in Yugoslavia would be unpopular among Americans, Clinton flatly ruled out this option. Pentagon officials also had serious concerns about sending American troops into the hostile regions of Serbia. 40. At the same time, they did not believe that the war could be won from the air. As is often the case, some in the U.S. government believed that a political rather than a military solution was required. The administration did not like congressional support to send troops into Kosovo, but no one wanted to do it. Speaking about the use of force in general, Benjamin Gilman R. New York, chairman of the House International Relations Committee, observed that such solutions do not eliminate the underlying problem. They promise to drag on indefinitely at high cost to our own nation. 41. However, the atrocities committed by the Serb forces in the summer of 1998 made war against Serbia seem inevitable. Although Clark initially lacked Pentagon backing for the use of force, he had the support of General Naumann and Anateo's military committee, which consisted of the top military officers of all member countries and was responsible for advising the North Atlantic Council NSC on military matters. On June 11, the Anateo defense ministers met in Brussels to consider the use of airstrikes and Anateo's role in solving the conflict. The United States and Britain were ready to back up their diplomatic efforts with force, as was Anateo's Secretary General Javier Solana, who had supported Clark's views from the beginning. Milosevic has gone beyond the limits of tolerable behavior, Solana acknowledged, and we are showing that we are willing to back up international diplomacy with military means. 42. In May 1998, the United States sent Christopher Hill, ambassador to Macedonia, to join Holbrooke in negotiations with Milosevic in Belgrade. Milosevic agreed to end the violence in Kosovo, promised that no repressive action will be taken against the civilian population. 43. And agreed to meet with Rugova. But soon this new agreement, too, was tossed away. Milosevic knew that the Anateo members did not all agree on the use of force, and he dug in his heels. On June 16, 1998, Anateo staged an air exercise called Operation Determined Falcon to show Milosevic what he was facing. About 100 Anateo aircraft took off from their bases, flew through Albania to the Serbian border, and then flew east in Albanian and Macedonian airspace. 44. The Kosovars rejoiced to the sound of the engines, and the Serbs heard them, too. The Europeans, notably the French, remained determined to find a diplomatic solution. France called for an international plan to restore autonomy to Kosovo and hinted that it would be willing to support military intervention, but it still maintained that a mandate from the UN Security Council would be needed before Anateo could go into action in Kosovo. 45. French Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine said, "The use of force could provoke exactly the opposite of the desired result." 46. Russia and China remain large obstacles to any use of force. They oppose taking an aggressive stand against Yugoslavia or any action that would penalize Yugoslavia. 47. The differences between American and European attitudes on how to deal with the humanitarian crisis renewed the strain on U.S.-European relations that had developed in the early 1990s over Bosnia. The European leaders' indecision made it impossible for the United States to negotiate effectively with Milosevic. The Germans complained that there seems to be very little willingness on the part of the Americans to treat the Europeans on an equal footing. But the European diplomats were passive, and it fell to the United States to lead the initiative to find 48. A solution in Kosovo. Holbrooke knew that the Europeans had accomplished little since the days of Bosnia, and he recognized that they were not going to have a common security policy for the foreseeable future. "We have done our best to keep them involved," he said. 49. Holbrooke believed that a successful Bosnian strategy calling for Serbian compliance with the UN and other confidence-building measures would work again in Kosovo, and Albright agreed. Still, the violence continued. On September 23, 1998, the Security Council passed Resolution 1199 demanding that all parties, groups, and individuals immediately cease hostilities and maintain ceasefire in Kosovo. The resolution demanded that Milosevic comply with earlier demands of the contact group for the withdrawal. 50. of forces from Kosovo, allow international verifiers, and resume negotiations. China did not support the resolution and abstained from voting. Unexpectedly, Russia came on board. The Russian representative Sergei Lavrov said the resolution was in line with Russia's principles because no measures of force and no sanctions at this stage are being introduced by the Security Council. 51 The Russian vote marked a diplomatic turnaround in the balance of forces in Serbia's war in Kosovo. With Russia siding with the United States, the threat of force became more real. Milosevic understood that an NATO war against Yugoslavia was a possibility, but he did not think it would be prolonged or costly. Clinton rallies the international community. In clear defiance of the West, 3 days after UN Resolution 1199 was passed, Yugoslav forces renewed their bombing runs. When the village of Gornj Obranj was attacked on September 26, 1998, it decided to fight rather than surrender. The village was largely destroyed. Most homes were burned. Cattle were left dying in the street. The Serbs stripped men of weapons, then killed them. The descriptions of the killings of men and boys being beaten to death or shot at close range, of entire families found dead in the forest, resembled accounts of earlier Serb attacks on Croats and Bosnians. Once again, there were beatings in the police station and on the street, men humiliated and forced to sing Serb songs. The Yugoslav army and Serb police's latest move largely drove the KLA into the mountains. 52. With no end in sight to the violence, President Clinton sought to rally international support for the use of force. Replacing calls to French President Jacques Chirac and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, he got their agreement in principle for an air campaign. Beniamino Andretta, Italy's acting defense minister, said that his country's forces were ready to join their NATO allies. Russia joined the group in backing Holbrooke's diplomatic efforts, but Russian Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov stated Moscow's opposition to any military strikes. Secretary Albright replied that the United States would not be deterred from acting because of Russian opposition. On September 24, 1998, pressure from the United States led NATO to adopt an Activation Warning Order Act 1, signaling a warning status for the deployment of air forces. The North Atlantic Council's approval of a limited air option and phased air operation codenamed Operation Allied Force moved NATO one step closer to a war against Serbia. Act 1 was not binding, but on October 12, the NATO countries took one step closer to action, specifying which forces they would contribute for an impending strike by approving Activation Orders Act towards authorizing preparations for a limited bombing campaign. With more than 400 aircraft standing by ready for a possible air campaign, NATO authorities voted to authorize strikes if security forces did not withdraw from Kosovo within 96 hours. To give Holbrooke the maximum leverage during his ongoing negotiations, the activation warning orders were issued before his meeting with Milosevic in Belgrade. First, Holbrooke demanded that Milosevic withdraw an estimated 4,000 Serb troops from Kosovo. Second, he demanded that Milosevic allow up to 2,000 civilian observers or verification ceasefire monitors under the auspices of the OSCE to ensure that the troops were withdrawn. Finally, he demanded that Milosevic set a timetable for negotiations and adhere to it. Milosevic agreed all too quickly, raising swift doubts about his sincerity in the minds of U.S. officials. So Solana and Clark flew to Belgrade to sign an agreement with Yugoslav military officials that would permit NATO reconnaissance planes to fly over Kosovo to verify the withdrawal. To everyone's amazement, by the end of October, large numbers of Yugoslav troops withdrew and the Kosovo verification mission monitors were deployed. Holbrooke was cautiously hopeful that the agreement could end the conflict, but the Serbian pullout was by no means complete. Large numbers of Serb police forces stayed in Kosovo and violence continued. On October 24, 1998, the Security Council passed Resolution 1203, which reinforced previous resolutions and stressed the need to address the current humanitarian situation and to avert the impending humanitarian catastrophe. 53 On November 17, the Security Council passed Resolution 1207, calling on Yugoslav authorities to comply with the requests of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia ICTY and arrest certain persons. 54 Milosevic ignored both resolutions. At the beginning of 1999, the contact group was still looking for ways to avoid fighting in Kosovo, although France had reluctantly lined up behind the American threat of NATO bombing. French Defense Minister Elaine Richard said, "We will share our part of the responsibility as the head of Europe and the alliance." But France articulated caveats, including that did not demand a Security Council mandate or threaten a veto. It emphasized its opposition to Kosovo independence and insisted that its troops would only get involved once U.S. troops were involved as well. Before proceeding with its air strikes, the contact group, which by now expanded to include Italy and Germany, decided to make one last attempt at a negotiated settlement, scheduling a meeting at a chateau in Rambouillet, France, near Paris, in February 1999. The road to Rambouillet. In January, before the negotiations at Rambouillet, Serbian forces intensified their activities in Kosovo. On January 15, all adult males in the village of Rakak were hunted down and killed. As Milosevic braced for the coming NATO attack, he only intensified the terror campaign in Kosovo. The massacre in the village of Rakak was a preview of atrocities to come. The Serb offensive that followed, called Operation Horseshoe, was a massive campaign to kill or expel all Kosovar Albanians. NATO observers thought the Serbs were preparing for a spring offensive that would target KLA strongholds. As Clark said later, "We never expected the Serbs would push ahead with the wholesale deportation of the ethnic Albanian populations." 55 According to Clark, the Serb forces numbered about 15,000 at this time. They included the regular Serbian police, the Blue, 56, uniformed Serbian Interior Ministry troops, the local police, and paramilitary troops commanded by indicted war criminals such as Zeljko Raznatovic, known as Arkan. Their tactics, sealing a town, killing all military-age males, and sending the rest of the population packing, were seen as evidence of planned genocide directed from the highest levels of government. 57 In January and February, Yugoslav officials reportedly collected key documents and records from different villages in central or western Kosovo for safekeeping, and valuable religious icons, paintings, and historical manuscripts were removed from museums and libraries and trucked north toward Belgrade. Belgrade was preparing a full-on campaign to create an ethnically pure Kosovo. 58. The ceasefire Holbrooke had negotiated with Milosevic in October 1998 did not end the fighting because it did not secure the withdrawal of Serbian forces from Kosovo. Instead, it spent the NATO consensus in support for forceful air intervention to secure nothing more than a ceasefire that Milosevic never intended to honor. This approach was taken in spite of the lessons presumably learned in Bosnia. The presence of Serb forces was the primary cause of continuing violence in Kosovo, and we should have demanded the removal. Peace would have to be imposed, not brokered. Meanwhile, the United States and the contact group met in London and set a final deadline of February 19 for the Yugoslav government and the Kosovo Albanians to accept a negotiated settlement. The contact group has made it unmistakably clear that the consequences of failure to comply will be swift and serious, Albright declared. 59. The peace negotiations at Rambouillet began on February 6, chaired by the British and French foreign ministers, Robert Cook and Hubert Bedrine. The French and British invited the OSCE, the EU, and the Russians, as well as U.S. Ambassador Chris Hill. Conspicuously absent, however, were NATO's Commander General Clark or any other high-ranking U.S. military officers. Kosovar Albanian leaders from both KL and LDK were invited, as were the representatives of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. The threat of airstrikes did compel the Serbs to attend. The Milosevic himself expected the talks to fail, and he declined to attend, sending Serb President Milan Milanovic as his deputy. Milosevic took NATO's absence to suggest that the United States and the contact group would not follow through on their threat of airstrikes. Three factors caused him to question NATO's credibility: that NATO did not compel him to attend the peace talks, as it had for the Dayton negotiations. Milosevic claimed that he might be exposed to arrest if he went to Rambouillet, that the OSCE still had 1,000 unarmed civilian monitors in Kosovo, whose safety would be endangered by bombing, and President Clinton's perceived reluctance to commit ground troops. Clinton had pledged to decide by February 1 whether he would send U.S. ground troops to Kosovo. On February 4, he said only that he was committed to considering emphasis added authorizing the troops. The Rambouillet conference moved forward largely as a result of the determined efforts of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who arrived after the meetings began and proceeded to personally manage the extremely complicated relations within the contact group and among Russia, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, the OSCE, Serbia, the Kosovars, Congress, and the media. The contact group presented its demands at Rambouillet as non-negotiable. 1. The KL must disarm. 2. Serb forces must withdraw from Kosovo under the supervision of 30,000 NATO troops. 3. Yugoslavia must restore Kosovo's autonomy and independent institutions. The issue of the future status of Kosovo would be considered in 3 years. U.S. diplomats found the Kosovo Albanians to be much less helpful than they had hoped. But the Albanians were not given crucial draft texts of political and security agreements, and therefore they never had the opportunity to express their concerns. Conference organizers permitted 29-year-old Hashim Fasai, a former Kosovar Albanian student leader who helped found the underground movement that became the KLA, to be seated as head of the Kosovar delegation. But after 12 days they handed him an annex to the agreement that called on the KLA to disarm and disband. After 2 weeks, there was progress, but at least one major sticking point: the Albanians refused to sign the agreement unless it guaranteed them a referendum on independence within 3 years. Albright was disappointed by the Kosovar Albanians' lack of cooperation. Albanian delegates blamed hardliners inside the KLA for this failure. Vetin Soroy, a moderate in the 16-member Albanian delegation, blamed Am Damasai, a former influential political advisor to the KLA, for wrecking the consensus. Still, by the time the Rambouillet meetings broke off in late February with plans to begin again in March, the Kosovar Albanian delegation had committed to sign the agreement when the talks resumed. The sequence was supposed to unfold as follows. 1. Kosovar accepts the 3-year interim self-government offer. 2. The agreement is imposed on Belgrade, using NATO airstrikes if necessary. 3. NATO ground troops are introduced to enforce the political settlement. The 82-page Rambouillet agreement spelled out terms that met most of the Kosovars' goals, but the contact group had ruled out their key goal: independence. Moreover, in an effort to accommodate the Serbs, the negotiators agreed to the disarming of the KLA without a parallel disarming and withdrawal of the Serb army, and they failed to impose meaningful limits on the number of Serb soldiers and police who could remain in Kosovo. They also offered to secure limits on the size of the peacekeeping force that would be deployed in Kosovo. Without even attending the meeting, then, Milosevic had gained most of what he wanted. The Rambouillet summit was doomed from the start. One major error was to grant the French demand that General Clark be barred from the conference, despite the Kosovars' request to meet with him. An effective NATO ground presence was essential to establishing a credible threat, and airstrikes were critical to sustaining Albanian morale. Clark should have been present. The contact group's refusal to accept the KLA as a permanent feature of the geopolitical landscape was yet another substantial policy error. And there were other errors. The war crimes provisions of the agreement was downgraded, and the United States missed an opportunity to repeat its Christmas warning. Perhaps the greatest flaws in the agreement were its concessions to Milosevic. It permitted Serbia to maintain a large and intimidating force in Kosovo: 4,000 military and police forces, 2,500 Ministry of the Interior Special Police, and 1,500 Army troops. It offered no provision for resolving the situation after the 3-year interim, for example, through a referendum, a major demand the KL eventually demanded, and it outlined no mechanism for enforcement. Notwithstanding these accommodations, however, the Rambouillet Accord was doomed to failure. Though the talks did resume, and the Albanian faction did sign the agreement on March 18, the Serbs walked away, and further negotiations were deemed futile. The rival of WAR, the extent of the devastation wreaked in Kosovo in the late 1990s can best be communicated through numbers. More than 10,000 people were killed and 1.3 million ethnic Albanians were driven from their homes. The failure of Rambouillet left only one option: war. When the NATO governments finally decided the time had come to use force against Serbia, the United States and NATO agreed to assist Kosovo, as they had finally provided arms and assistance to Croatia and Bosnia, enabling them to defend themselves against Milosevic. There was still resistance to the idea of sending U.S. forces to Kosovo to help protect the Kosovars, as some argued that such an action was contrary to the law of Yugoslavia, the nation of which Kosovo was a part, and that to send troops into a province in a sovereign state would constitute an invasion. But at Rambouillet, the contact group had announced that such an action might not be considered an invasion if its purpose was to protect Kosovar civilians from Serb armies. Whether such an action amounts to an intervention or a course of peacekeeping, it was nothing new. The Bush and Clinton administrations had undertaken much the same kind of action without the consent of the nations in question in Somalia and Haiti. By now it was clear that Milosevic could not be controlled by diplomatic means. He had ignored his October 1998 ceasefire agreement with NATO, boycotted Rambouillet, and ignored the resulting accord signed by the Kosovars. By 1999, Milosevic's nationalist campaign had long since been transformed into a shocking reign of terror directed at Kosovar civilians, including children. President Clinton's goals for Kosovo were humanitarian. They included the return of refugees, the goal of all interventions in which unarmed civilians are driven from their homes. Clinton's team had tried to negotiate a settlement and a ceasefire and identify a space for peacekeeping. 60 NATO's war in Kosovo came 3 years after the signing of the Dayton Accords and after nearly a year of unfettered Serb violence against the Kosovar Albanians. By the time NATO bombs started falling on Serbia, nearly 90% of the Kosovar Albanians had been displaced. Before NATO could go to war, approval was required under the U.S. Constitution from the U.S. Congress. Congress was deeply divided on Kosovo, both between and within the parties, but the situation on the ground was rapidly deteriorating. Kosovars fleeing to Albania were being killed en route by Serb irregulars. Finally, on March 23, 1999, the Senate voted to approve the NATO bombing. The House, however, refused to do so when it voted 1 month later. Many analysts have characterized the inability of the United States and the European countries to prevent Milosevic's violence as a failure of diplomacy. I disagree. What these analysts failed to understand was that the problem was not a diplomatic one. The problem was Slobodan Milosevic himself, a power-hungry dictator who responded not to diplomatic commitments but only to force, a man whose main goal was to fashion at any cost an ethnically pure Kosovo inhabited only by Serbs. Despite their lengthy experience with Milosevic in Bosnia, where ceasefires had been repeatedly ignored, the Europeans and Americans took a remarkably long time to realize that Milosevic would never willingly negotiate a solution to the Kosovo dispute. The Europeans' faith in dialogue and their aversion to force made them especially ineffective in dealing with Milosevic. Ultimately, the destruction and mass murder in Kosovo were stopped only by the application of American force and NATO air power. And this came to pass only because key officials in the Clinton administration, especially General Clark, Secretary Albright, and Clinton himself, grasped that diplomacy had to be backed by force in dealing with such a bloodthirsty dictator. Force and more force. In March 1999, for the first time in its 50-year history, NATO went to war. The purpose of the action was not to defeat the Serbs, to conquer the Yugoslav armed forces, to cause regime change, or to win independence for Kosovo. Rather, it aimed to persuade Milosevic to stop the violence. On March 24, a NATO aircraft started the bombing campaign against Yugoslavia. 61 General Clark's first priority was to incapacitate the Serb air defense and military communication systems. NATO used precision bombs that targeted the Serbian military and avoided civilian targets. After 4 weeks of bombing, however, Milosevic remained defiant. In fact, he decided to speed up the killing and expulsion of ethnic Albanians. According to Human Rights Watch, between the beginning of the NATO air raids and their cessation in June 1999, the Serbs undertook a systematic campaign to terrorize, kill, and expel 62 ethnic Albanians, an initiative organized by the highest levels of the Serbian and Yugoslav governments. On March 25, the day after NATO strikes began, Serb forces burned 200 to 600 homes in the town of Jekovica. 63 during the NATO air campaign. Approximately 863,000 sought refuge outside Kosovo. An additional 590,000 were internally displaced. Altogether, over 90% of the Kosovar Albanian population was displaced. 6. The Washington Post called the Serbian action the most ambitiously ruthless military campaign in Europe in half a century. 64. 65. On April 3, the Serbian people showed their support of Milosevic and their defiance of the West by holding a rock concert in Belgrade. 66. Within a month, however, the economic effects of the war began to be felt, though most people still did not have to go far for electricity or water. The turning point came when the daily lives of the Serbian people were seriously affected. On March 27, day 4 of the airstrike campaign, the second stage of the air war began. Now, in addition to bridges and highways, NATO began bombing Serbia's military-industrial infrastructure, its electricity plants, and its oil pipelines and refineries, thereby destroying the Serbian economy. According to the Independent International Commission on Kosovo, NATO knocked out 70% of Serbia's electricity production capacity and 80% of its oil refinery capacity. By the end of May, there were increasing signs that Belgrade is feeling the heat, according to State Department spokesman James Rubin. 67. The morale of the people began to crumble, and anti-war demonstrations and protests replaced pro-war rock concerts throughout Serbia. In the Serbian towns of Kakek and Kruševac, protesters reportedly shouted, "The dead do not need Kosovo." 68. Between 500 and 1,000 Serb soldiers deserted in Kosovo. 69. NATO threatened to use ground troops if Milosevic did not surrender. After Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin held an unsuccessful meeting with Milosevic in Belgrade on April 24, the NATO allies and the U.S. administration began seriously considering the use of ground troops. Britain's Chief of Defense, General Charles Guthrie, threatened that Yugoslavia's war machine is going to be weakened again day after day, week after week, and we will be able to choose our time for entering with ground troops. 70. The increasing unpopularity of the war at home, the inability of the Serb government to control its military forces, and NATO's threat of broadening its campaign convinced Milosevic that his chances of retaining power would be greater if he gave in to NATO's demands and ended the war. Turning points. Before the first bomb was dropped on March 24, Serb military forces and paramilitary gangs had swarmed into Kosovo's capital, Pristina, and the surrounding cities, driving Kosovars out of their homes, burning houses, stores, factories, and restaurants, raping, beating, and killing. Once the bombing started, foreign journalists, especially Americans, were subjected to hostile treatment, shoved, slapped, threatened, arrested, interrogated, and expelled, their cameras and other equipment smashed. After the foreign observers and journalists were driven out, it became harder to get detailed information about events inside Kosovo. As the war progressed, however, it became clear that the Serbs had launched a full-scale ethnic cleansing campaign, moving from village to village, torching houses, seizing and sometimes executing Albanian teachers, journalists, and political leaders, and beginning the ominous separating out of boys and men that had preceded the massacres in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is said that this deadly work was carried out by the followers of the war criminal Arkan, among the most brutal ethnic cleansers in Croatia and Bosnia. Because the myth of NATO aggression was already being circulated by Milosevic apologists, it is important to remember that the buildup of Serb forces was already taking place before NATO reluctantly started bombing. Milosevic's intentions were clear: to use his growing forces to drive the 1.8 million Albanians Muslims out of Kosovo before war even began. He had already driven 400,000 of them from their homes, destroyed more than 500 villages and 22,000 houses, and killed more than 2,000 persons. One of the original objectives of the air war protecting Albanians from Serb aggression proved unattainable. Wave after wave of refugees arrived daily in neighboring countries, with fresh tales of abuses and killing by Serb forces. Eventually, General Clark acknowledged that bombing could not stop the harsh mistreatment of the victims. Not every aspect of the NATO campaign was an immediate success. In early June, when NATO offered the Kosovo rebels their first NATO air support in an unsuccessful bid to break a Serbian siege along the Albanian border and to show the Serbs and perhaps themselves that they were able to fight, the experience showed that the Serb military remained a military force of considerable strength. U.S. Secretary of Defense William Cohen commented that the Serbs had not yet surrendered. At this point, not one single Serb soldier has withdrawn from Kosovo. 71 he conceded. NATO forces had not definitively defeated the Serbs, and American pilots were still flying B-2 bombers on 30-hour missions from Missouri to Kosovo. Yet by this time the die, after nearly 3 months of bombing, was cast. After several discussions between Milosevic and the Russian envoy Viktor Chernomyrdin, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot met with the Russians in Rome to discuss how to end the war. Many of the outstanding issues were resolved in talks among Chernomyrdin, Clinton, and Vice President Al Gore. They planned the withdrawal of Serb troops and an occupation with NATO in the central role. At the Group of 80 G8 meeting in Cologne in June, Russia ended its opposition to the UN peace plan, and the principles of the settlement were adopted at the G8 meeting on June 2. The proposal required the following: immediate and verifiable end to violence and repression in Kosovo, demilitarization of the KLF forces, withdrawal from Kosovo of Serb military, police, and paramilitary forces with a phased detailed timetable and a buffer zone behind which Serb troops were to withdraw, deployment of an international civil and security presence that would include NATO forces under the auspices of the UN, establishment of an interim administration in Kosovo to be determined by the UN Security Council, safe return of all refugees and displaced persons, access for humanitarian organizations, establishment of a political process aimed at substantial self-government for Kosovo, comprehensive approach to the economic development and stabilization of the crisis. 72. Although Russian Foreign Minister Ivanov said that his country's participation in peacekeeping was not certain, all the G8 countries signed the agreement. 3 days before the war ended, after 11 weeks of airstrikes, the Serbs finally withdrew from the Kosovar village of Kakinik, stripping it as they left. KLA soldiers welcomed the NATO forces. They quickly found a mass grave containing the bodies of 28 men in several areas that had been sacked and burned by forces led by Serbia's Justice Minister General Dragoljub Jankovic. 73. On June 3, Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari, Talbot, and Chernomyrdin went to Serbia to present the peace plan to Milosevic. It was a take-it-or-leave-it proposal. If Milosevic left the meeting without agreeing to the proposal, they told him NATO's pounding of Yugoslavia would continue and the terms of any future agreement would be worse. They also presented Milosevic with a military technical agreement that detailed the phased pull-out of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia FRY forces in 12 days. 74. According to the technical agreement, the withdrawal of the Serbian military from sections of Kosovo would be synchronized with the entry of the Kosovo Force KFOR. With no other option, Milosevic agreed. The Serb parliament formally approved the peace plan the same day. The use of force had prevailed. The NATO bombing would continue until 3. Conditions were satisfied in the following 24 hours. 1. The Serbs had to begin their withdrawal from Kosovo. 2.2. NATO would then begin a 24-hour pause in the bombing. And 3. The Security Council had to pass a resolution endorsing the deal. On June 10, 1999, Serbian troops began pulling out of Kosovo. British General Jackson notified NATO Secretary General Javier Solana that the pullout had begun, and Solana directed Clark to call off the airstrikes. President Clinton was on the telephone with Tony Blair when Javier Solana called to inform him that the Serbs were moving out of Pristina and Kosovo. Milosevic claimed a victory for the best army in the world. 75. Declaring, "We never gave up Kosovo." The Albanians waited for the Serbs to leave. An estimated 840,000 refugees began to filter back into Kosovo. 76. After the Serbs' withdrawal, the United States, the United Kingdom, and NATO devised a partition of Serbia. Within 4 days of the end of the war, the Russians unexpectedly rolled into Pristina, throwing the delicate plans and timetable into disorder. Serb women rushed forward to embrace the Russians, who saw their success in arriving first in the capital of Kosovo as a great victory. Russia's foreign minister, Igor Ivanov, called the early arrival an unfortunate mistake, and NATO generals feared that their Russian counterparts might have ordered the advance without the approval of the Russian civilian leadership, ending the war. 14 of the 15 members of the Security Council voted for Resolution 1244, which was adopted on June 10, 1999. The resolution set forth a plan that gave the UN sweeping responsibilities in Kosovo, policing the province, overseeing human rights abuses, organizing elections, and overseeing the return of more than 1 million refugees and displaced persons. The resolution gave NATO sweeping powers, including the task of deterring renewed hostilities. Secretary General Kofi Annan was to appoint a special representative to ensure close cooperation with the NATO-led force. The ending of the war pointed up some of the frictions among UN members over the NATO action in Kosovo. China withheld approval of Resolution 1244, complaining that NATO's attacks had violated the Charter of the UN but did not veto the agreement. Russian Security Council Representative Sergei Lavrov, one of the resolution's co-sponsors, said his country sternly condemned the NATO aggression against Yugoslavia. The resolution left ambiguous the future role of Russian troops, who were outside the NATO chain of command. Cuba's representative accused the NATO allies of genocide in Serbia. As Annan's director of communications, Shashi Tharoor, said the war was a NATO war, the peace will be a United Nations peace. A series of further Security Council resolutions followed. Resolution 1244, passed on June 10, governed the details of ending the war, though it made no specific reference to NATO's plan to deploy 50,000 peacekeepers in Kosovo. 77. When those troops began to move in for the occupation that followed, they found Kosovo riddled with evidence of Milosevic's rule of terror. The Serbs had raped, beaten, and killed thousands of Albanians, and some 800,000 Kosovars had been displaced. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees UNHCR estimated that Kosovars had fled to other countries in the following numbers: Albania 444,000, Macedonia 247,000, Montenegro 69,600, and Bosnia-Herzegovina 21,700. Peace was much needed, although there was little peace to keep. 79. The cost of a year of negotiations was high. According to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, Carla Del Ponte's report to the UN Security Council, from January 1998 until the end of the NATO campaign, the Serbs killed more than 11,000 people in Kosovo. 78. Del Ponte's office reported 2,108 bodies exhumed from 195 of 529 known mass graves, and perhaps 6,000 bodies in all the mass graves. Europe had not seen atrocities of such magnitude in the years since the Second World War. The fact that genocide was possible in Europe at the dawn of the 21st century seemed incredible, but after the experience in Bosnia, it is amazing that no one reacted sooner to Milosevic's ethnic cleansing of Kosovo. Some have said that Clinton made a mistake in announcing that he would not send American ground troops to Kosovo, that it only emboldened Milosevic, who believed he could outlast an air campaign. But Clinton ultimately provided enough force and leadership to prevail, and the NATO air campaign was definitely a success. Approximately 750,000 refugees have returned to their homes, a remarkable testament to the success of U.S. and NATO policy. 80. After the war, there is no doubt that life in Kosovo improved considerably after the NATO bombing, which brought an end to Milosevic's campaign of violence. After the defeat, and in the face of economic deterioration in Serbia, Milosevic lost popular support and was overthrown in the parliamentary election of 2000. Vojislav Koštunica was elected as president, and reformist Zoran Đinđić served as Serbia's prime minister until his murder by a Belgrade-based criminal gang, according to the Serbian government in 2003. In the years since, Belgrade has made greater efforts to cooperate with Kosovo authorities in the West. In June 2001, it handed Milosevic over to the International War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, and the Yugoslav government has been relatively more responsive to Western demands for democratization. 81. Strains in relations between Belgrade and Pristina persist, however, as the question of Kosovo's ultimate status remains unresolved. The Serbian government expects Kosovo to come under Serbian administration once the UN interim administration ends. The Kosovar Albanians, on the other hand, expect Kosovo to become independent. In March 2002, when the leaders of Podgorica and Belgrade signed an agreement to form a union of Serbia and Montenegro, the issue of Kosovo's status returned to the fore. 82. The mention of Kosovo as part of Serbia in the preamble of the draft Serbian constitution renewed mutual suspicions and sparked again demands for an independent Kosovo. 83. The Serbian government was not inclined to allow Kosovo to separate, but the agreement allowing Montenegrins to decide freely the future status of their union with Serbia offered hope that Belgrade and Pristina might reach a similar peaceful agreement for greater Kosovo autonomy. The political framework established by Security Council Resolution 1244 is important to Kosovo's improved situation. The resolution adopted the proposals from the G8 meeting in Cologne, which still classify Kosovo as constitutionally part of Serbia, but under an international protectorate. It is administered under the civil authority of the Non-Interim Administrative Mission in Kosovo UNMIK, established on June 10, 1999.84, pending final settlement of the matter. UNMIK was responsible for promoting the establishment of substantial autonomy and self-government in Kosovo, for performing basic civilian administrative functions, for organizing and overseeing the development of provisional institutions for democratic and autonomous self-government, including holding elections, transferring administrative duties to these institutions as they are established, for facilitating a political process to determine Kosovo's future status, for supporting the reconstruction of key infrastructures, for maintaining law and order, for protecting human rights, and for ensuring the safe and unimpeded return of refugees and displaced persons to their homes in Kosovo. 85. Security in the region was administered by an international security force, KFOR, which includes forces from Canada, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Lithuania, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Sweden, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The problem of how and whether to incorporate Russian troops was solved when the Russians marched over from Macedonia and took over the Pristina airport. 86. The incident ended with incorporation of Russian troops into NATO forces and the assignment of 2,850 Russian troops to the U.S., French, and German multinational brigade Kosovo sectors. The Russians also retained responsibility for security at Pristina airport with another 750 troops. 87. But life in Kosovo is by no means back to normal. The economies of both Kosovo and Serbia were destroyed, and although the genocide was halted, the simmering hatred between the two sides and the extremism and discrimination cultivated over a decade of violence cannot be easily eliminated. Despite these problems, the prolonged UN presence has contributed positively to achieving long-term peace and stability in the region. UN efforts at reconciliation have encouraged the Serb and ethnic Albanian communities to cooperate. On July 23, 2000, representatives from both communities signed the Early Declaration at the Early House in Warren, Virginia. They agreed to work together toward building a peaceful accommodation. Despite great pains and sorrows suffered in past conflicts, they agreed. 88. To cooperate in the development of democracy, free media, civil society, and the return of the displaced people, and to create conditions for greater and safer participation of the Serbian community in local elections. This cooperation, however, was more easily achieved on paper than in reality. Despite efforts by the UN to involve the Serbian community in the democratic process, the Serbs boycotted municipal elections on October 28, 2000, and elections for the Kosovo Legislative Authority on November 17, 2001. 89. Still, the UN reported that the elections went smoothly with voter turnout of 64.3% of Kosovo's 125 million eligible voters, and without any major incidents. 990 Kosovars elected Ibrahim Rugova's moderate party, the Democratic League of Kosovo LDK, with 46% of the vote, although the LDK did not get enough votes to form a majority government. A much longer-term problem is the huge damage that was done to Kosovo during the 1990s. Although thousands of Kosovo refugees were eager to return from their temporary refuge in Macedonia, Albania, and Montenegro, the landscape they found when they arrived was devastated, full of destroyed villages and uninhabitable houses. Hashim Thaçi, the leader of KLA, pledged that Kosovo would be a democratic nation and encouraged people to think that Kosovo would have respect for human rights, a free media, democratic institutions, and free and democratic elections. 91. As reported by the New York Times, Thaçi told a news conference that the Yugoslavs should finally come to the realization that the future of Kosovo will be decided in Kosovo proper. In retrospect, most Americans and much of the NATO leadership underestimated the strength and determination of Milosevic and the Serb leadership. Winning Ugly, the excellent study of the Kosovo conflict by Ivo Dalder and Michael O'Hanlon, provides ample documentation of the pervasive, consistent underestimation of Serb strength. For example, they quote Secretary Albright on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer on March 24, 1999, the night the bombing began. "I don't see this as a long-term operation. I think this is something that is achievable in a relatively short period of time." 92. This expectation, the authors say, was widely shared in Europe among civilian and political leaders alike. 93. Still, however, they may have underestimated the timing. The Western powers scored an important moral victory in Kosovo. Faced with a violent aggressor who refused to heed warnings, NATO took action armed not with a mandate from the UN Security Council, but by consensus of its member nations, including the United States Congress. Even with congressional approval, some still feel that NATO should not have acted without a specific Security Council mandate. At the time, some members of the contact group were uncertain about the legal basis of their action, but the Yugoslavs had refused to comply with numerous demands from the Security Council under Chapter Roman 7 of the UN Charter. This non-compliance underlay the North Atlantic Council's decision to act. They expected another Security Council resolution would be passed in the near future. In the meantime, however, Slobodan Milosevic was posing an ever-increasing threat to international peace and security. Time was of the essence, and NATO seized the day.
That's bullshit.